step into the shadowed past where fear was not just felt, it was woven into the very fabric of reality. Imagine standing before a cold stone pyre where the crackling flames leap high, casting grotesque shadows upon a crowd that waits with bated breath. What unseen forces could drive humanity to such madness? What dark truths lie beneath the accusations, the trials, and the fires that consumed the accused? As history's whispers rise from the ashes, one question remains. What is it about fear, about the unknown, that still haunts us to this day? The Devil's Mark. In the shadowed world of the witch trials, the Devil's Mark was a symbol of ultimate guilt. This mark was thought to be a physical sign, a wart, mole, or other blemish, that indicated a witch had made a pact with the devil. It was believed that this mark could not be felt by the accused, a mark that existed only to those who were meant to find it. In some cases, the Devil's Mark was used as the sole evidence to convict someone, condemning them to death. But what if this mark wasn't a physical trait at all, but rather a manifestation of fear, an accusation disguised as evidence? The mark became an unassailable truth, an accusation transformed into evidence that could justify execution. As the trials escalated, the search for these marks became more desperate. In some trials, witches were even pricked with needles or knives to find the mark, a practice that often resulted in deep pain or even death. The more the accusers looked, the more convinced they became that evil was among them, embodied in these supposed marks. But in truth, these marks were nothing more than the natural imperfections of the human body, manipulated by fear and superstition. How many innocent women met their end simply because of their natural human flaws? The Devil's Mark became an emblem of power over life and death, and for the people of that time, it was more real than the accusations themselves. These marks were feared, and those who bore them were believed to have the power to summon the devil and cause calamity at will. In reality, the mark was the mark of fear, revealing the darkest side of human nature, how fear could consume and distort the truth. The Salem Witch Trials, a web of fear. In 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, became the heart of one of the most infamous witch hunts in history. What began with a few accusations quickly spiraled into a frenzy, resulting in the deaths of 20 innocent people. The trial process was fueled not by evidence but by superstition, hysteria, and the unchecked power of fear. The accusations spread like wildfire, and soon the entire town was embroiled in the chaos. It was not just witches who were targeted, but anyone seen as a threat to the social order. Spectral evidence, a practice where testimonies of visions and dreams were accepted as legitimate proof, made it nearly impossible for the accused to defend themselves. The very nature of witchcraft trials created a feedback loop of fear. The more people who were accused, the more fear spread, and the more the trials consumed the town. Was it truly witches that terrorized Salem, or was it the weight of collective paranoia, the fear of the unknown, and the desire to control the uncontrollable? Salem's witch trials ended in regret and sorrow, but the fear remained long after the executions. The town was left to grapple with the destruction it had wrought. The fear of witches may have ended, but it was replaced by an even deeper fear, the fear of the darkness within. What was it about this community that allowed the witch hunts to thrive, and how does it resonate with the world today? Could the real witchcraft have been the fear itself, the fear of the unknown, of women, of power, and of what could never be controlled? The Maiden's Revenge, the Witch's Curse. Agnes Waterhouse's execution in 1566 marked one of the earliest known witch trials in England. Before her death, she allegedly cursed the judge who sentenced her, and soon after, misfortune befell his family. Her death wasn't just a trial. It was a reminder of the real power of fear. Fear of women, fear of power, and the dark unknown. Agnes's death wasn't just a loss of life. It was a symbolic victory for fear itself, showing how deeply embedded the fear of witches had become in society. The curse of Agnes Waterhouse wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a symbol of the unseen power that witches were believed to wield. Even in death, they were not truly gone. Their influence could still be felt, their anger and resentment lingering in the world of the living. It was the very idea of this power that frightened communities, as they realized that even after a witch was executed, she could still hold sway over the lives of those who wronged her. In the years following her execution, the story of Agnes Waterhouse's curse would continue to haunt the minds of the people. It was not the death of the witch that caused the most terror. It was the lingering thought that no matter how far one tried to escape, the witch's influence would still be felt. The real question remains, was the curse the result of dark magic, or was it the fear itself, twisting reality and blurring the line between myth and truth, witchcraft and the Inquisition? A deepening horror. The Spanish Inquisition became one of the most notorious institutions in history, and it had a deep hand in the persecution of suspected witches. Women who practiced herbal medicine or other forms of non-Christian rituals were accused of witchcraft. The Inquisition didn't just accuse witches, it accused anyone who defied the Church's authority. The methods were ruthless. Torture, burning, and forced confessions were the norm. What drove the Inquisition's relentless pursuit of witches? Was it merely religious zeal, or was it a deeper fear of losing control over a society already teetering on the edge? The methods used by the Inquisition were not just about proving guilt, they were about instilling fear. The accused were tortured until they confessed to crimes they never committed. The more people confessed, the more power the Inquisition gained, and the deeper the web of fear became. Could this relentless pursuit of truth be more about control than justice? The real horror, it seems, wasn't just in the executions, it was in the machinery of fear and a power that turned the trials into an unending cycle of suffering. In the end, the Inquisition failed to extinguish the fear it sought to control. It only fueled the darkness, turning suspicion into terror, and terror into a tool for power. The real question remains, did the Inquisition hunt witches, or did it hunt the very idea of defiance itself? The witches' teats. Alleged witches were believed to have witches' teats, abnormal growths on their bodies that were used by demons to suckle. These marks were thought to be evidence of a witch's pact with the devil. The belief was so deeply rooted that authorities often searched for these marks during trials. In truth, many of these so-called marks were nothing more than natural skin blemishes, growths, or moles. But fear, once ignited, is a force that cannot easily be extinguished. What if these teats were not evidence of witchcraft, but rather of society's deep-rooted fear of what it could not understand? The search for the witch's teats was a chilling and invasive process. It involved pricking and probing the accused, often causing lasting physical harm. In some cases, these marks were so small that only the most zealous inquisitors would claim to have found them. The very notion of the teats was a tool for controlling the accused, turning their very bodies into evidence of dark deeds. It was less about finding proof, and more about reinforcing a belief that was already deeply embedded in the hearts of the accusers. The belief in witches' teats reveals a disturbing truth, that fear has the power to manipulate the body, to turn natural imperfections into signs of guilt. These so-called teats were the physical manifestations of a fear that permeated the culture. The real horror was not just in the accusations, but in the way the human body itself became an object of suspicion and control. Witches and animals, familiar spirits. The concept of a witch's familiar was central to the trials. Familiars were believed to be demonic animals, cats, toads, and other creatures that witches used to carry out their dark magic. These creatures were thought to be agents of the devil, capable of aiding witches in their wicked deeds. To many, a black cat with glowing eyes or a toad with sinister intentions was a clear sign of witchcraft. But what if the real magic lay not in the animals, but in the fear they invoked? Were these creatures merely symbols of society's terror, or did they truly possess the powers attributed to them? The idea of familiars was tied to the belief that witches communicated with the devil through their pets or animals. These familiars were often seen as manifestations of the devil's influence. The witch would summon them to do her bidding, from hexing enemies to causing death or destruction. But was this belief rooted in any real danger, or was it just an easy way to explain misfortune and illness in a world that lacked the understanding of natural causes? The more these familiars were accused, the more powerful they became in the eyes of the accusers. In the end, the witch's familiar was less about the animal itself and more about the power of suggestion, the fear of what the familiar represented, a connection to the devil, to forbidden knowledge, to evil, became its own force. The witch and her familiar were united in the public imagination as agents of dark magic, forever linked by the terror they invoked in the hearts of the masses. Witchcraft and child sacrifice, the darkest allegations. One of the most horrifying accusations levelled at witches was that they sacrificed children to the devil in exchange for power. This gruesome claim was often brought forth during witch trials, where women were accused of using their dark magic to summon demons and engage in terrible rites. Although there was no concrete evidence, the belief in child sacrifice was enough to condemn many to death. But what if these accusations were a reflection of the deep fears of the time, rooted in the fear of female power, fertility, and control over life and death? The accusation of child sacrifice became a symbol of everything that was feared about witches, their ability to manipulate life, death, and innocence. In many ways, these allegations spoke to a society's deepest anxieties about women's roles in childbirth, child-rearing, and healing. Witches were feared not just for their ability to harm, but for their perceived ability to control life itself, an unnerving power that threatened the social order. These fears were so deeply ingrained that they became woven into the fabric of witchcraft accusations. The belief in child sacrifice fueled the witch hunts, adding another layer of horror to an already terrifying era. What these accusations truly reveal, though, is not the power of witches, but the power of fear to shape reality. The true horror was not in the acts accused of the witches, but in how the accusations themselves could change lives forever. The line between myth and reality became blurred, as the fear of witches morphed into a much larger cultural fear, a fear of women's power over life. The witches' trial, swimming as proof of guilt. During the height of the witch trials, one of the most brutal methods of determining guilt was the swimming test. Accused witches were bound and thrown into water, and if they floated, they were deemed guilty, as it was believed that water would reject the unholy. If they sank, they were considered innocent, but often drowned in the process. This cruel practice was a symbol of the society's desperate search for definitive proof, but it also showed how deeply fear and superstition were embedded in the trials. Could the swimming test have been a reflection of society's inability to separate belief from truth? This method of trial was not only dangerous but was based on the belief that witches were impervious to the purity of water. To float was proof of the devil's touch, and the only way to truly prove innocence was to sink into the cold depths. However, many innocent people died, and the question remains, was the drowning an act of divine justice, or was it the result of a fearful, superstitious society grasping at straws in its attempts to explain the unknown? The swimming test serves as a chilling reminder of how far fear could push a society to abandon reason in the face of perceived evil. It was not about justice, but about eliminating the threat of the unknown. The real horror lies in the fact that such tests were considered acceptable in a society that had already allowed fear to dictate its actions. Torture, as proof, a deadly form of confession. The witch trials were not just about accusations, they were about extracting confessions, often through horrific means. Torture was one of the most common methods of proving guilt. From the crushing of limbs to the stretching of the body, the methods were cruel and unrelenting. Accused witches were subjected to unimaginable pain, often confessing to crimes they never committed simply to end their suffering. The question arises, did these confessions prove anything, or were they merely the result of a system designed to force truth from pain? These confessions, often coerced under the threat of death, were used as evidence to fuel further trials. But did they uncover the truth, or did they merely serve to justify the witch hunts? The real horror of the trials wasn't just in the executions, it was in the way that torture became a means to control, to break down the spirit of the accused until they were forced to speak words they had never uttered. The true tragedy of the witch trials lies in the fact that so many innocent lives were destroyed, not by proof, but by the twisted logic of torture. The society that allowed these methods to continue was as guilty as those accused of witchcraft. The trials, in many ways, were less about justice, and more about the unchecked fear of a world that could not understand the unknown. The last witch burned in England. Joan of Bristol was the last woman to be executed for witchcraft in England in 1684. Her death marked the end of an era of witch hunts that had ravaged Europe for centuries. But was her death truly a victory for reason, or was it simply the culmination of a dark and bloody history? As England moved away from the fear of witchcraft, the lingering question remained: how many innocent lives had been lost to superstition, paranoia, and fear? Joan's execution was symbolic, marking the transition from a belief in witches as physical threats to an acknowledgement that the witch trials were rooted in fear. By the end of the 17th century, most of Europe had begun to question the methods of the witch hunts. Yet, the death of a single woman couldn't erase the scars left by centuries of persecution. The last witch burned in England represents both an end and a beginning. It marked the closure of a dark chapter in history, but the wounds of that time remain embedded in the stories of those who suffered. The real question is, can we truly escape the shadows of the past, or are we doomed to relive these cycles of fear and persecution? The witch-hunting frenzy. Witch hunts weren't isolated to one region or time period. From Europe to the American colonies, the fear of witches sparked a frenzy that tore through societies. In many cases, the accused were innocent people, often women, who were either outsiders or simply misunderstood. Fear, superstition, and paranoia fueled the fire, leading to the mass executions of witches. The hunt became its own terrifying beast, driven by hysteria and the need to root out perceived evil. But what if the real danger wasn't in the witches, but in the fear itself? What if it was fear that turned neighbour against neighbour, friend against friend? The witch hunts were not only a battle against the supernatural, but a weapon of social control. Power-hungry men, like the Witchfinder General, used fear to manipulate communities, fueling accusations and creating scapegoats. In some places, the hunt was driven by economic interests. Land was seized, fortunes were gained. What's more terrifying than a witch hunt that thrives on the destruction of lives for personal gain? The fervour of the hunt, once ignited, could not be easily extinguished, and the accusations kept coming. Fear of witches had the power to consume entire communities, creating divisions where none existed before. Families turned against each other, and the very fabric of society tore apart under the weight of suspicion. The witch hunts were not just about burning bodies, they were about burning the trust that held communities together. Could fear have been the true witch, hiding in the hearts of the accusers, not the accused? Witches and the Witchfinder. General Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witchfinder General, was responsible for leading one of the most notorious witch hunts in England. His methods were brutal and relentless, resulting in the execution of over 100 people, mostly women. Hopkins, an ambitious and self-proclaimed expert, claimed to possess the power to identify witches using his witch-finding techniques. However, his methods were not based on science or logic. They were based on fear, manipulation, and a desire for personal gain. Hopkins' hunt for witches became a symbol of the terrifying power fear held in medieval society. The methods used by Hopkins and other witchfinders were cruel and unsophisticated. The accused were often subjected to extreme measures to force confessions, including sleep deprivation, physical torture, and invasive examinations. In many cases, the testimonies obtained under these conditions were false, yet they were used to justify executions. The real horror was not just in the killing of innocents, but in the way society had embraced the idea that witches were real, and that any means of finding them was justified. Hopkins was eventually exposed as a charlatan, and his witch hunts came to an end. But the damage had been done. Fear had been unleashed, and countless lives had been lost. His story serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and fear, and the way fear can be used to justify horrific actions. Was Hopkins truly a man of justice, or was he just a man who wielded fear as a weapon to control those who dared defy the norms of his time? The Bishop's Curse. One of the most infamous curses tied to witchcraft came from the mouth of a bishop in 1590. When Bishop John Deacon was accused of witchcraft by his enemies, he reportedly cursed those who had wronged him. His curse was said to have led to the sudden death of several of his accusers, casting a dark shadow on the community. Whether real or imagined, the curse became a chilling reminder of the power that accusations of witchcraft held over people's lives. Were these deaths the result of supernatural powers, or had fear given them power? The curse attributed to Deacon was more than just a tale of vengeance. It became a symbol of the power of words, of the fear they could generate. People began to believe that a curse could carry more weight than any trial. The real horror of the curse wasn't in its magical power, but in the way it fed the paranoia that gripped the community. Was it really a curse, or was it the fear of the unknown that caused such misfortune? As time passed, the curse was woven into the fabric of the community's folklore, and it grew into a powerful symbol. The fear of witches and curses lingered long after the events themselves. Could the real curse be the way that fear warped reality, and how it continued to affect the lives of those who lived in its shadow? The Black Book of Witches. The Black Book was said to be a magical tome, containing dark secrets, incantations, and rituals used by witches. This mysterious book was believed to be the source of witches' power, containing knowledge that could control both the natural and supernatural worlds. Whether it was a real book or simply a myth, the idea of the Black Book spread fear among the masses, symbolizing the knowledge that witches could wield. Was this book a physical object, or was it a metaphor for the fear of women's autonomy, knowledge, and power? The Black Book was often linked to the devil, as it was believed that witches used it to summon demons and perform evil rituals. The idea of the book served to reinforce the image of witches as sinister, dark figures who used forbidden knowledge to manipulate the world around them. What is truly terrifying about the Black Book, though, is not just the power it supposedly contained, but the fear it instilled in society. In reality, the Black Book may never have existed, but the idea of it, the fear it generated, was very real. The concept of a book containing forbidden knowledge served to reinforce the belief that witches could control forces beyond human understanding. What made the Black Book so dangerous wasn't its contents, but what it represented: the fear of the unknown and the power of knowledge that could not be controlled. The Witch's Test, the touch test. The touch test was another infamous method used during witch trials to identify guilty witches. The accused witch was told to touch the victim, and if the victim's affliction ceased or improved, the witch was deemed guilty. This test was seen as a divine intervention proving the accused's guilt, but it was based entirely on superstition. The touch test placed immense pressure on the accused, forcing them into situations where the outcome was determined by hysteria rather than logic. How many innocent people suffered under such an illogical system? In many cases, the touch test was used not to reveal the truth, but to deepen the sense of fear and accusation. The victim's affliction, often a physical or mental illness, was treated as evidence of a witch's curse. What if the true horror of the touch test wasn't in the witch's supposed power, but in the manipulation of society's fear to create a reality where logic and reason no longer mattered? The touch test revealed just how far superstition could influence society's actions. It was less about seeking justice and more about feeding the cycle of fear and mistrust. The real question is, how many people were caught in the web of fear, made to suffer under false accusations simply because of a twisted belief in the supernatural? Witchcraft and the evil eye. The evil eye was one of the most feared aspects of witchcraft. It was believed that witches could curse others simply by looking at them, sending bad luck, illness, or even death upon their victims. This belief was widespread, not just in Europe, but across the world. The idea that a simple glance could possess such power speaks to the deeply rooted fear of witches and their perceived ability to manipulate the world around them. But could the fear of the evil eye be more than just superstition? Could it be the expression of a deeper, more primal fear of unseen forces? To ward off the evil eye, many wore amulets or charms, believing they could protect them from a witch's malicious gaze. These charms, such as the evil eye symbol or the hand of Fatima, became common protective tools in many cultures. The fear of the evil eye was pervasive, indicating the deep mistrust of individuals who could wield such unseen power. But what if these protective measures were more than just superstitions? Were they expressions of a cultural need to control fear itself? The fear of the evil eye reveals much about the power of belief. What is truly terrifying about it is not the curse itself, but the pervasive fear that comes with the idea that such dark forces could exist within a simple look. The evil eye symbolizes the power that fear has over reality. and how superstition can become a tool for both protection and destruction. Was it the witches who wielded power, or was it the fear of their gaze that truly shaped the fates of their victims? Famous witch trials in Germany. Germany was home to some of the most brutal witch trials in history. One of the most infamous trials took place in Würzburg, where over 900 people were executed. The trials were fueled by a combination of religious zeal, fear, and political power. The hunt for witches was not just about eradicating evil. It was a way to consolidate power, control communities, and eliminate perceived threats. The trials in Germany revealed the deep cultural and political forces that contributed to the witch hunt, leaving behind a legacy of fear and mistrust. The witch trials in Germany were marked by horrific tortures and forced confessions. The accused were often subjected to extreme measures, such as the breaking wheel to extract confessions. These trials were not about finding the truth. They were about maintaining control, instilling fear, and perpetuating the idea that witches were responsible for all that went wrong in society. Was it fear that turned these trials into an all-consuming frenzy, or was it the desire for power that fueled them? The trials ended in the early 18th century, but the legacy of the witch hunts lived on in Germany for centuries. Fear of witches continued to shape society long after the trials ceased, leaving behind a fractured culture marked by suspicion and tragedy. The real horror of the witch trials wasn't just the loss of life, it was the lasting impact of fear itself. Could the trials in Germany have been a glimpse into the way power and fear could corrupt a society? The witch's familiar, an unholy bond. The concept of a witch's familiar is one of the most enduring and sinister aspects of witchcraft lore. Familiars were thought to be animals, such as cats, owls, or toads, that served witches as their spirit companions. These creatures were believed to be agents of the devil, capable of carrying out magic on the witch's behalf. The bond between a witch and her familiar became the focal point of many witchcraft accusations, symbolizing the unholy connection between the witch and dark forces. But were these familiars simply the products of imagination, or did they represent the fear of the unnatural and the unknown? Familiars were believed to help witches perform magical tasks, from casting spells to healing or hexing enemies. These animals were said to possess otherworldly powers, as if they were vessels for demonic spirits. In some witch trials, the accused were tortured or killed based on their association with these creatures. But what if the real power wasn't in the familiar, but in the fear they represented? Could the fear of witches be amplified by the belief that these seemingly innocent animals were capable of carrying out sinister deeds? The idea of the witch's familiar represents a cultural obsession with control over nature, life, and even death. It also reveals a deep-seated fear of the unknown, of the things that lurk in the shadows and cannot be easily explained. Were familiars simply a scapegoat, used to explain the unexplainable, or did they truly hold power over the lives of those accused of witchcraft? Witchcraft and prophecy. Many accused witches were believed to possess the ability to foretell the future. Prophecy, divination, and the ability to see the unseen were common accusations levied against witches. Women who had a deep knowledge of herbs, astrology, or healing were often labelled as witches, accused of using these powers to manipulate others. Could the real danger of prophecy have been the fear it inspired? The fear of knowing the future, of knowing too much? What if witches weren't feared for what they could do, but for what they could see? Prophecy was often tied to fear of the unknown. Witches were accused of knowing things that they should not know, things that others feared to discover. This fear grew into hysteria as people began to believe that witches could foresee death, disaster, or even betrayal. What if this fear wasn't about witches themselves, but about the human desire to control the future? Were witches merely the scapegoats for a fear of fate and destiny that could not be avoided? Witchcraft and prophecy became entangled, and the real question is whether witches truly had the power to predict the future, or if it was the fear of that power that caused so much harm. Could the true power of prophecy lie in the mind's ability to create its own future through fear? The witch's curse on the town. It was believed that witches could place curses on entire towns, causing illness, famine, and death to spread among the populace. The concept of the curse was so powerful that entire villages could be terrorized by the mere idea of one woman casting a spell to bring harm. These curses were often blamed for bad harvests, unexplained illnesses, or sudden tragedies. What if the real curse wasn't one of magic, but one of fear, a belief so deeply ingrained in society that it became self-fulfilling? The belief in a witch's curse turned into an unstoppable force, driving the villagers into a frenzy of fear and suspicion. In their desperation, they would turn to accusations, naming a scapegoat to carry the blame for the curse. It wasn't the witch's magic that caused the harm, it was the belief in the magic that did. The true horror of the witch's curse was not in its magic, but in the fear it ignited. That fear had the power to destroy lives, to break communities apart, and to convince people that their misfortune was the work of a dark force beyond their understanding. Could it be that the real curse was the belief in witchcraft itself? Witches and the Black Book. The idea of the Black Book of Witches has haunted folklore for centuries. It was said to contain the rituals, spells, and dark secrets that witches used to summon demons and perform their sinister magic. Whether it was a real book or a mere myth, the fear surrounding it was palpable. The very idea that such a book could exist, containing the power to control life and death, was enough to send shivers down the spines of many. What if the real power wasn't in the book itself, but in the belief that such dark knowledge existed? The Black Book was often believed to be a gift from the devil himself, a way for witches to commune with dark forces. Many were tortured or killed based on the belief that they possessed such a book, and it became a central point of accusation in witch trials. However, it was never proven to exist. Was the Black Book a real source of power, or did it simply symbolize the fear of the unknown and the fear of knowledge that could not be controlled? In the end, the Black Book represented much more than just a collection of spells. It was a symbol of fear, of control, and of the boundaries between the known and the unknown. Those accused of witchcraft were often believed to possess it, and their very lives were destroyed by a book that might not have ever existed. But fear, as we know, has the power to make myths real, and this myth had the power to end lives. The witch's mark, a symbol of dark power. The witch's mark was believed to be the sign of a witch's connection to the devil. It could appear as a mole, scar, or any natural imperfection, but it was thought to be a tangible proof of witchcraft. This mark was considered an indelible mark of the witch's pact with dark forces, a way for the devil to communicate his power through the accused. How many innocent people were accused based on the shape of their skin? What if the real mark of a witch was not something physical, but the fear it created in the minds of those who sought to find it? The hunt for the witch's mark became one of the most invasive parts of the witch trials. The accusers would use needles, knives, and even hot pokers to find the mark, believing it to be impervious to pain. These searches, often performed in public, were designed to humiliate the accused, to expose them as witches in front of the entire community. But could the true horror of the witch's mark lie not in the mark itself, but in the way fear turned a person's body into an object of suspicion? What if the witch's mark wasn't a real physical manifestation of dark power, but a symbol of the fear of women, of their strength, and of the power they were believed to wield? The mark became more than just a physical sign. It became a way of controlling women, of erasing their voices and identities, of turning them into objects of terror. Witches and the Devil's Black Sabbath. The Witches' Sabbath, or the Black Sabbath, was believed to be a secret gathering where witches would come together to worship the devil, perform dark rituals, and summon demons. The Sabbat was thought to be a place where witches would engage in everything from cannibalism to sexual rites, often under the guise of dark, arcane magic. The Sabbat symbolized everything that society feared about witchcraft: the breaking of taboos, the rejection of God, and the surrender to dark forces. But how much of the Sabbat was real, and how much was fabricated by those who sought to control and eliminate the other? The idea of the Sabbat became a powerful tool for the accusers, as it painted witches as agents of pure evil. The most horrific accusations revolved around the idea that witches would gather at these Sabbats to make pacts with the devil, often performing unspeakable acts. The real horror of the Sabbat wasn't just in the twisted rituals. It was in the idea that such acts could exist in the shadows of society, beyond the reach of control. The witch's sabbat represented the breaking of boundaries, the crossing of lines that society dared not cross. It was a symbol of fear, of the unknown, and of the unchecked power of the imagination. But was the sabbat real, or was it merely a product of society's fear? A fear that witches represented something far more terrifying, power that could not be controlled. Witch hunts in Scotland was the site of some of the most brutal witch hunts in Europe. The famous Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1597 saw dozens of women executed for witchcraft, many accused of causing death, destruction, and misfortune. These trials were fueled by a mix of fear, superstition, and religious zeal. What made the witch hunts in Scotland particularly terrifying was the fact that they weren't limited to women. The Scottish witch trials accused both men and women, and children were often dragged into the frenzy. What drove this obsession with witches in Scotland, and what role did fear play in these gruesome events? The Scottish witch hunts were characterised by extreme cruelty. Accused witches were tortured, often subjected to swimming tests or forced confessions under duress. What made these hunts particularly terrifying was the way they were intertwined with political and social unrest. The witch trials became a tool for those in power to control communities, eliminate enemies, and justify fear. Could the witch hunts have been driven more by a desire for control than by a real fear of witches? The true horror of the Scottish witch hunts wasn't just in the executions, but in the way they tore apart communities, turning neighbours into accusers and families into enemies. These hunts revealed the deep, unsettling truth that fear can turn ordinary people into instruments of violence, causing them to act in ways that defy logic and humanity. Was it really witches they feared, or was it the uncontrollable fear itself that spread through the land? Witches and the Malleus Maleficarum. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, was a book written in 1487 by Heinrich Kraumer and Jacob Sprenger. It became one of the most influential texts used to justify the witch hunts across Europe. The Malleus provided detailed instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and execute witches, reinforcing the belief that witches were enemies of God. What was truly terrifying about this book wasn't just its content. It was the way it legitimized the hunt for witches and the methods used to persecute them. The Malleus Maleficarum played a key role in spreading the fear of witches. Its descriptions of witches' powers, which included the ability to control weather, cause disease, and even summon demons, turned them into terrifying figures in the minds of the public. This book didn't just encourage witch hunts, it created the very framework for them, giving legitimacy to the idea that witches were a threat that needed to be eradicated. The real horror of the Malleus Maleficarum lies not in the idea of witchcraft itself, but in the way it enabled a society to turn on itself. It showed how a fear of witches could be institutionalized and legitimized, leading to the deaths of thousands. Could the true legacy of the Malleus be the way it showed how fear can be used to control and justify violence? Witches and their magical herbs. Herbal remedies were often associated with witchcraft, as many witches were believed to possess knowledge of plants that could heal or harm. These herbs, like belladonna, mandrake, and henbane, were considered powerful, capable of inducing visions, causing death, or curing illnesses. In the eyes of those who feared witches, any woman with knowledge of these plants was a potential witch. But what if the true power of these herbs lay not in their magical properties, but in the fear they evoked? Were these plants really magical, or did they simply reflect the deep mistrust of women's knowledge and autonomy? The belief that herbs could be used for both healing and harming led to widespread fear. If a woman's garden contained plants known to have medicinal or poisonous properties, she could be accused of using them to cast spells. The line between healer and witch became dangerously thin. In many trials, women who used these herbs for legitimate healing were tortured until they confessed to dark deeds they never committed. Was this just a misunderstanding, or was it the product of a society desperate to control knowledge? The fear of witches' magical herbs reveals a deeper cultural anxiety. The fear of knowledge that exists outside the realm of male authority. The real horror wasn't in the plants themselves, but in the control that women wielded over nature, life, and death. Could it be that the herbs were just symbols of a much deeper fear of women's independence, power, and the unknown? The execution of Margaret Jones. Margaret Jones was an early victim of the witch hunts in America. Accused in 1648, she was the first woman in the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be executed for witchcraft. What made her case particularly chilling was that she was a well-known healer in the community, someone who had helped countless people with her knowledge of herbal remedies. But her skills were seen as dangerous, and she was convicted based on little more than suspicion and fear. The question is, how much of Margaret's execution was based on her supposed witchcraft, and how much was rooted in the fear of women's power over life and death? Her execution marked a tragic turning point in the witch hunts in colonial America. While many others were accused in the years to come, Margaret's case set the tone for future trials. The terrifying truth was that accusations of witchcraft could be made on the slightest of grounds: suspicion, a personal vendetta, or even a misplaced rumour. In the end, Margaret Jones was executed not for a crime she had committed, but for a crime that society invented out of fear. Her death was a testament to how deeply fear could warp justice. What was truly terrifying was the fact that an entire community could decide that one woman's knowledge of healing was so dangerous that it warranted execution. Was the execution of Margaret Jones a product of superstition, or was it a dark warning about the dangers of fearing what we do not understand? Witchcraft in ancient Rome. Witchcraft has deep roots in history, dating back to ancient Rome. Roman society had a complex relationship with magic, often viewing it with a mix of fascination and fear. Witches, or strigae, were believed to possess the ability to control the forces of nature, cast curses, and even manipulate people's minds. The ancient Romans didn't have the same witch hunts that later emerged in medieval Europe, but they still feared witches as dangerous beings capable of destroying the natural order. How much of this fear was based on reality, and how much was rooted in a society's need to control the unknown? Roman witches were often depicted as women who had power over life and death, capable of casting spells and causing illness or misfortune. Witches were believed to be able to curse entire families, making their neighbours believe that their misfortunes were the result of magic. In a society where power was closely tied to control over the natural world, witches posed a direct threat to the social order. Were these witches simply women with knowledge, or were they symbols of a much deeper fear? Fear of losing control over nature? Roman society was not without its own witch trials, though they were far less brutal than those in later centuries. The Romans were not immune to the fears that witches inspired, and those accused of witchcraft could still face exile or death. What made the Roman witch trials particularly fascinating is that they show how the fear of witches existed across cultures, representing the universal desire to control the unknown. The Witches of Wittenberg. The town of Wittenberg, Germany, is often remembered for its association with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, but it also became notorious for its witch trials. Between 1500 and 1700, Wittenberg witnessed the execution of many accused witches, and the trials were often conducted with religious fervour. These witch hunts were fuelled by both the Reformation and the Inquisition's desire to root out heresy and dark magic. What made the Wittenberg trials so terrifying was the intersection of religion, fear, and the desire to purge society of perceived evil. Wittenberg's witch trials were often brutal, with women being tortured and executed based on little more than rumours or accusations. The fear of witches was deeply tied to the idea of heresy, the belief that witches were working against God's will. Wittenberg's trials were part of a broader European panic that tied witchcraft to religious rebellion. Could the real threat be the fear of women defying religious authority? The trials in Wittenberg reflect a larger societal fear of women who held power, knowledge, or autonomy. Witches were seen as rebellious figures, refusing to conform to the religious and social norms of the time. What if the true terror of the witch hunts in Wittenberg wasn't the witches themselves, but the fear of women who had the knowledge and courage to stand apart from the conventional? The witches' rituals and the devil's influence. Witches were often accused of performing dark rituals, thought to be carried out with the assistance of the devil. These rituals were believed to involve offerings to demons, spells to control others, and sacrifices that gave witches power over life and death. But how much of this was true? Were these rituals the acts of witches, or were they simply the imaginations of those who feared the unknown? The idea of the witch's ritual reflects a deep societal anxiety about power, control, and the supernatural forces that could not be understood or controlled. In many cases, witches were believed to engage in these rituals under the influence of the devil himself. These rituals were said to provide witches with dark powers, enabling them to control the forces of nature, heal or harm others, and even cause death. But was the ritual truly the work of the devil, or was it a metaphor for the fear and suspicion that dominated the society? Could these rituals have been exaggerated, used as a tool to demonize women and strip them of their autonomy? The real horror of these rituals wasn't in the practices themselves, but in how they were twisted by fear. These rituals represented the unknown, and the unknown was a powerful force in a world where superstition and religion ruled. The real question remains, were witches truly performing dark rituals, or was the ritual of fear far more powerful than any spell they could cast? Witches and the witch's knot. The witch's knot, also known as the witch's thread, was a symbolic charm often associated with witchcraft and dark magic. It was believed to be a powerful talisman, used by witches to bind their enemies or to protect themselves from harm. The knot was often tied using intricate patterns, and it was said that if the knot was undone, the curse would be broken. But what if the real power of the witch's knot lay not in its mystical abilities, but in the fear and control it represented? Could it be that the knot symbolized the binding of the unknown, the locking away of fears that could never be fully understood? The witch's knot was often used to create a sense of control over dark forces, both real and imagined. It was believed that if a witch tied the knot with specific words or incantations, she could imprison her victim's soul or bind their fate. In some cultures, the knot was seen as a protective charm against witches, something to be hung in doorways or around the neck to ward off evil. What if the real fear wasn't the power of the knot itself, but the fear of being controlled by forces beyond human understanding? In the end, the witch's knot represents the deeper fear of control and the unknown. It is a symbol of binding, both literal and metaphorical, that holds within it the idea that unseen forces can shape our fates. Whether used for protection or to curse, the knot embodies the power of belief, the idea that something as simple as string can hold dominion over life, death, and fate itself. The Witch's Black Sabbath. The Witches' Sabbat, or Black Sabbath, was thought to be a secret gathering of witches where they worshipped the devil, held dark rituals and conspired against the Christian order. These gatherings were believed to be accompanied by vile rituals, including the consumption of human flesh, blood, and other unspeakable acts. But could these Sabbats have been nothing more than exaggerated fantasies born from a fearful religious society? The Sabbat became an enduring symbol of everything that was feared about witchcraft: the rejection of God, the corrupting influence of the devil, and the breaking of societal taboos. What was most terrifying about the Sabbat wasn't just the rituals, but the idea that such gatherings could be happening secretly, right under the noses of the authorities. It symbolized the deep fear that a hidden world of darkness existed, beyond the reach of the law and religious authority. The Sabbat became an all-consuming symbol of rebellion against both the natural order and the church itself. Could the fear of these Sabbats be rooted not in truth, but in the human need to explain what could not be understood? The real horror of the Sabbat was not just in the accusations of unspeakable acts, but in the power that these acts were believed to hold over people's minds. The Sabbat, whether real or not, was a symbol of the fear of the unknown, of what might be hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Were the witches truly gathering in secret to worship the devil, or was it the fear of rebellion, of unchecked power, that haunted the imaginations of those who sought to control society? The witch's test, the search for proof. One of the most terrifying aspects of witch trials was the search for proof of witchcraft. In many cases, witches were subjected to horrific tests, such as being pricked with needles, forced to drink poisonous concoctions, or even thrown into water to see if they would float. These tests were designed to reveal the truth of the accused, but the results were often predetermined. If the accused failed the test, they were deemed guilty. What if the true test wasn't about finding witches, but about finding ways to justify fear and persecution? The swimming test was one of the most notorious methods used to determine guilt. If the accused floated, it was a sign they were guilty of witchcraft, as water was believed to reject the unholy. If they sank, they were considered innocent, but in many cases they drowned. This test was a cruel reminder of how fear and superstition shaped justice, and how a society could abandon logic in favour of a system that justified death based on irrational beliefs. The witch's test wasn't about truth, it was about fear, control, and the desire to eradicate the unknown. The real horror of the trials was not in the execution, but in the ways that people were manipulated into accepting an unjust system that allowed fear to rule over reason. How many innocent lives were lost simply because they could not pass a test designed to confirm the worst fears of society? Witch trials in the colonies. The American colonies, like Europe, were not immune to the fear of witches. The first witch trials in the colonies took place in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where a wave of hysteria led to the execution of several people. The accusations in the colonies were driven by a mixture of religious fervour and superstition, much like those in Europe. What made the colonial trials unique, however, was that they were intertwined with the emergence of a new society, one that was struggling to define itself in the face of new challenges and fears. The trials in the colonies were often fueled by personal vendettas, with neighbours accusing each other of witchcraft based on grudges, envy, or misunderstandings. The process of accusing and convicting witches became a tool of social control, as people were pressured to turn on each other in order to protect themselves. This climate of fear ultimately led to the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of many more. Was the true enemy in the colonies the witches themselves, or was it the fear and paranoia that led to the trials? The trials in the colonies reflect the deep, unsettling truth that fear can cause a society to turn on itself. The witch hunts were not just about the persecution of individuals, they were about the power of fear to destroy communities. Could the real horror lie not in the witches, but in the way that fear of witches could unravel the fabric of an entire society? Witches and the Devil's Mark. The Devil's Mark was one of the most feared symbols during the witch hunts, thought to be the physical sign that a witch had made a pact with the devil. It was believed that this mark could not be felt by the accused, and many women were tortured or killed based on nothing more than the presence of an imperfection on their skin. In some cases, the Devil's Mark was thought to be invisible to the naked eye, and could only be revealed through special techniques, such as pricking or pressing. What if the Devil's Mark wasn't real at all, but a metaphor for the deep-rooted fear of women's power and autonomy? The belief in the Devil's Mark served as an excuse to torture and kill women who were seen as threats, whether because of their knowledge, independence, or simply because they did not conform to societal expectations. The mark became more than just a sign of guilt. It became a symbol of the witch's supposed power and her connection to the supernatural. Was it possible that the Devil's Mark was not a physical mark at all, but a mark of fear placed upon the bodies of those accused? The true horror of the Devil's Mark was not just in its physical appearance, but in the way it became a tool for social control. It was an accusation that could not be disproven, and once someone was marked, their fate was sealed. Could it be that the Devil's Mark was less about supernatural power and more about the power of fear over the human body? Witches and the Evil Eye. The evil eye has long been associated with witches and witchcraft. It was believed that witches could cast curses and bring misfortune simply by looking at someone with a malevolent gaze. The idea of the evil eye was not limited to any one culture. It spanned across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, with varying interpretations. In some cultures, people believed that the evil eye could cause illness, death, or bad luck, and it was thought to be the mark of someone who had turned their power over to dark forces. But could the real power of the evil eye lie not in the witches themselves, but in the fear they inspired? Those who were accused of casting the evil eye were often isolated and marginalized, with their gaze seen as a dangerous and uncontrollable force. People believed that by simply locking eyes with a witch, they could bring about disaster. This idea permeated medieval and early modern society, leading to accusations and punishments based on little more than superstition. But what if the evil eye was not just a reflection of witchcraft, but a symbol of society's fear of power? Power that could not be explained or controlled. The fear of the evil eye ultimately contributed to the broader witch hunt hysteria. It was not just witches who were feared, but anyone with the power to influence others, even if that influence was invisible or imperceptible. The true horror was not in the curse itself, but in the paranoia that led to such accusations. Was it the witches who wielded power, or was it the fear of that power that truly shaped the fate of the accused? Witchcraft and prophecy. Throughout history, witches were often believed to possess the ability to predict the future. This connection between witchcraft and prophecy was fueled by the idea that witches could see beyond the veil of time, interpreting omens, visions, and signs that others could not. In many witch trials, women accused of witchcraft were also accused of foretelling doom, causing widespread panic. But was this connection between witches and prophecy real? Or was it a product of society's fear of women who could wield knowledge and power beyond conventional understanding? Prophecy was often seen as a sign of the devil's influence, and witches who claimed to possess prophetic powers were persecuted for their ability to see the future. The belief that witches could control fate and predict disasters made them terrifying figures in medieval and early modern society. But how much of this fear was rooted in the desire to control what could not be controlled? Were witches truly gifted with knowledge of the future, or were they simply scapegoats for society's inability to understand the mysteries of the world? The real horror of prophecy lay in the uncertainty it provoked. What if these visions were simply products of the mind, amplified by fear and suspicion? The witch's ability to predict the future was not so much about magical foresight, but about the fear of what could be, of things that could not be explained. In the end, the real question is, was it the witches who predicted doom, or was it the fear of the unknown that made prophecy such a powerful tool of control? The trial of the French witches. The witch trials in France were among the most infamous in Europe. The town of Loudun in particular became a hotbed of witchcraft accusations in the 17th century, leading to mass trials and executions. The most famous case involved a group of nuns who were allegedly possessed by demons, leading to a witch hunt that spiraled out of control. The trials were not just about finding witches, but about controlling and punishing those who defied religious authority. Was this just a case of mass hysteria, or was it a reflection of a society struggling to maintain power over a rapidly changing world? The trial of the French witches was marked by elaborate and often absurd accusations. The nuns claimed to have been bewitched by a priest, leading to a series of bizarre confessions and the eventual execution of several individuals. The trial became a spectacle, one that was fueled by fear, jealousy, and the desire to control a population that was increasingly questioning authority. What if the true power of these trials lay not in the witches themselves, but in the fear they stirred among those who felt their control slipping away? The legacy of the French witch trials is a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. The fear of witches and the possession they were believed to cause led to violent and unnecessary deaths. Could the true horror lie not in the accusations, but in the way that fear can take hold and consume an entire community, turning reason into superstition? Witches and their flying powers. The belief that witches could fly was one of the most enduring and terrifying aspects of witchcraft lore. Witches were believed to ride broomsticks or other flying devices, often under the cover of darkness, to attend the witches' sabbat, or to carry out their dark deeds. The idea of witches taking flight represented a fear of the unearthly, of breaking the bounds of nature, and of defying both gravity and divine authority. But was the belief in witches flying based on reality, or was it simply a symbol of society's deep fear of female power and the unknown? The belief in flying witches was often tied to accusations of sexual deviance and forbidden rituals. It was believed that witches, empowered by the devil, could take to the skies and spread chaos across the land. The fear of flight was more than just fear of the witches. It was fear of losing control over the natural world. Could this belief have been an attempt to rationalize the chaos of a world where women wielded power over life, death, and the forces of nature? In the end, the idea of flying witches represented a much deeper fear, the fear of freedom and autonomy. The witch was not just an enemy of the church, She was a figure who could break the bounds of society and the laws of nature. What if the true terror of flying witches wasn't in their power, but in the threat they posed to a rigid, controlled world that feared their defiance? The burning of Joan of Arc, one of the most famous figures in French history, was burned at the stake in 1431, accused of witchcraft and heresy. She had led French troops to victory in the 100 Years' War, claiming divine visions had guided her, but her success frightened the powers that be. Her trial was a political one, but her execution came to symbolize the terror and desperation that witch hunts could evoke. Joan's death wasn't just about her belief in divine intervention, it was about the fear of women who defied authority. Joan's death was not just an execution, it was a symbol of the power of fear to crush anyone who defied the established order. Her execution marked the tragic end of a young woman who had led armies and believed that she was chosen by God to save her country. The true horror of Joan's trial was not just in the accusations of witchcraft, but in the way they were used to silence a powerful voice, to eliminate someone who posed a threat to those in power. Joan of Arc's death remains one of the most poignant examples of how fear, superstition, and political motives could destroy an innocent life. Her execution was not just about witchcraft, it was about the threat of a woman who dared to wield power. Was her death a result of heresy, or was it the result of a society too afraid of what she represented? Witches and their familiar spirits. Familiar spirits were believed to be the loyal companions of witches, often taking the form of animals like cats, owls, or toads. These spirits were thought to act as intermediaries between witches and the devil, helping them to carry out dark magic and cast curses. The relationship between a witch and her familiar was considered sacred, a bond that enabled the witch to wield powerful forces. But could these familiars be more than mere tools of the devil? Were they symbols of a deep-seated fear of what the other could possess, an unexplainable power, the ability to control the unseen forces of nature? Familiars were not always animals, however. They were sometimes thought to be human spirits or even the devil in disguise. This made them all the more terrifying, as they symbolized the witch's unholy bond with powers beyond human comprehension. The notion of a familiar spirit represented the fear of those who had the ability to connect with the supernatural, to control the forces of life and death. Were these spirits truly magical, or were they merely a product of the hysteria surrounding witchcraft? The fear of witches' familiars continued to spread across Europe, becoming a core element of witchcraft accusations. In many cases, witches were accused of using their familiars to harm the innocent, and their familiar spirits were considered evidence of their pact with the devil. The horror of these accusations lay not just in the witches themselves, but in the idea that anyone could possess power over life and death. Could the familiar be the true symbol of fear? A fear of things beyond control, beyond understanding? Witches and their magical brooms. The iconic image of a witch flying on a broomstick is one of the most enduring symbols of witchcraft. It is believed that witches used brooms to travel through the air during their secret rituals or to attend the witches' sabbat. The broomstick, which was initially just a household tool, became a symbol of a witch's magical power. But what if the broomstick wasn't just a tool for flight, but a symbol of women's independence, their ability to traverse the boundaries of the domestic sphere and enter realms of power beyond the ordinary? The idea of witches flying on broomsticks reflected society's fear of women stepping outside of their traditional roles. The broomstick was both a symbol of domesticity and of rebellion, a tool used for both mundane chores and for mystical journeys. In a time when women were expected to remain within the confines of their homes, the broomstick was a metaphor for defiance, for breaking free of societal constraints. Was it the broomstick itself that terrified people, or was it the power it symbolized? The power to control one's own fate? The flight of the witch represented more than just a physical act. It was a metaphor for freedom, autonomy, and power. The broomstick was not just a means of transportation, it was a sign of the witch's ability to transcend the limitations of the earthbound world. Could the true horror of the broomstick lie not in the flight itself, but in the way it challenged the natural order, defied authority, and gave women the power to control their own destinies? The Witches of Pendle Hill. The Witches of Pendle Hill were involved in one of the most famous witch trials in English history. In 1612, 12 people from the area were accused of witchcraft and were put on trial, with several of them eventually executed. The trial became a symbol of the fear and paranoia that swept through England at the time, as accusations of witchcraft were often fueled by personal grudges, jealousy, and fear of the unknown. The Pendle witches were not just victims of superstition, they were caught in a web of fear, suspicion, and social unrest. The Pendle trial revealed much about the way in which fear could turn a community against its own members. The accused witches were often isolated women, many of whom had knowledge of healing or herbalism, which made them targets for suspicion. The trial was less about justice, and more about using the fear of witchcraft to consolidate power and control within the community. Were the Pendle witches really practicing dark magic, or were they merely victims of a society struggling to understand and control the unknown? The true horror of the Pendle witch trials lies not in the witches themselves, but in the way fear was weaponized to destroy lives. The trial became a symbol of how easily a society could be swayed by paranoia and superstition, turning the most vulnerable into scapegoats. Could the real evil of the Pendle trials lie not in the accused witches, but in the fear that consumed an entire community? Witchcraft and poisoning trials. In many witch trials, witches were accused of using poison to carry out their dark magic. These poisonings were often blamed for the sudden death of livestock, children, or even adults. The act of poisoning was tied to the belief that witches could control the natural world, bringing harm to others without being detected. But what if the poisonings were simply the result of illness, accidents, or the inability of people to understand natural causes? Were these accusations more about society's need to explain misfortune, or about the fear of those who were seen as outsiders or different? Accusations of poisoning were often linked to women who were seen as outsiders, or who had knowledge of herbs and healing. In many cases, these women were the targets of personal vendettas or social jealousy. The belief that women could wield poison as a tool for revenge or power fueled the witch hunts, turning ordinary remedies into weapons of suspicion. But what if poison was simply a symbol of society's fear of women who had the knowledge to heal and harm, and who could not easily be controlled? The fear of poisoning reveals how deeply suspicion could permeate a society, and how easily rumours and accusations could turn into fatal consequences. The horror was not just in the poison, but in the way it allowed society to label individuals as other, turning them into targets for fear and persecution. Was it the poison that caused the deaths, or was it the fear of the unknown that had the real power to destroy lives? Witch trials in the colonies. The witch trials in the American colonies, particularly in Salem, became infamous for their brutal and deadly pursuit of witches. The trials were fueled by religious zeal, superstition, and the belief that witches were agents of the devil. In a small, isolated community, fear of witches spread quickly, leading to accusations based on little more than rumours and suspicions. The Salem Witch Trials, in particular, exposed how fear could spiral out of control, turning an entire society into a bloodthirsty mob. Were the trials truly about hunting witches, or were they about the fear of losing control over a society built on religious orthodoxy? The Salem trials were marked by irrational fears, manipulated confessions, and the endless search for proof. The accused were often tortured, their confessions extracted under duress. The trial process was based not on reason or evidence, but on the hysteria that had overtaken the town. The real horror of Salem wasn't just in the executions, it was in the way fear turned a community against itself, destroying lives based on the flimsiest of accusations. The witch trials in the colonies weren't just about witches, they were about the fear of women, power, and the unknown. The hysteria that fueled these trials became its own dark force, consuming the lives of the accused and leaving scars on the community that would last for generations. Could the real enemy be the fear itself? The Devil's Pact in witch trials. A core element of many witch trials was the belief that witches made a pact with the devil. This pact was said to grant witches supernatural powers in exchange for their souls, a bargain that was both feared and reviled by society. The idea of the Devil's Pact became the ultimate proof of guilt, as it was believed that witches could only obtain their powers by submitting to the devil's will. But how much of this belief was based on truth, and how much was it the result of religious propaganda designed to further demonize and control women who dared to defy societal norms. The pact with the devil became the central accusation in many witch trials, with the accused often forced to confess under torture. Once the confession was made, the person's fate was sealed, and execution was often the only outcome. The fear of the devil's influence over witches spread rapidly, and it justified brutal methods of torture and execution. But could it be that the fear of witches wasn't just about their supposed powers, but about the control they had over their own lives, and their refusal to conform to religious authority? The real horror of the Devil's Pact was not in the witch's alleged power, but in the way it became a tool for the church and the state to eliminate perceived threats. It was the fear of women's independence, knowledge, and ability to reject societal constraints that made the pact so terrifying. The Devil's Pact, in many ways, was a projection of the society's own fear of losing control over women's lives, desires, and destinies. The Witches of Wittenberg. Wittenberg, a town most famously known for Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, also became the site of intense witch trials. In the 16th century, the fear of witchcraft was so deeply ingrained in the town that several women were accused of consorting with the devil. The town's witch trials were marked by extreme torture and harsh interrogations, a reflection of the deep religious anxiety that accompanied the rise of Protestantism. But was the real fear in Wittenberg about witches, or was it the fear of the new religious order, which was destabilizing long-established structures of power? The trials in Wittenberg were an expression of the growing tension between the Catholic Church and the emerging Protestant faith. Witches were seen as agents of the devil, a threat to the religious authority of the Church. But could the trials have been more about consolidating power, both religious and political, than about seeking truth? The true horror of the Wittenberg trials may lie not in the witches themselves, but in the way religious and political authorities used fear to maintain control. The Wittenberg trials left behind a legacy of fear and suspicion that plagued the community for years. The accusation of witchcraft was not just an individual punishment, it was a tool used to control entire populations. The real horror of these trials wasn't in the witches themselves, but in how the trials perpetuated the cycle of fear that tore apart families and communities. The Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins. Matthew Hopkins, often known as the Witchfinder General, is perhaps the most notorious witch hunter in English history. Operating in the 17th century, Hopkins led a series of witch hunts in East Anglia, where he and his associates were responsible for the deaths of over 100 accused witches. His methods were cruel, including the use of sleep deprivation, physical torture, and invasive searches to find the witch's mark. But what if the real terror was not in the witches themselves, but in the terrifying power that Hopkins held over life and death? Hopkins' witch hunts were driven by both personal gain and the fear of the unknown. He claimed to be acting on divine authority, yet his motivations were more likely rooted in ambition and a desire for power. The fear he spread through communities was amplified by his ability to manipulate the minds of both the accusers and the accused. What was truly terrifying about Hopkins wasn't his methods. It was the way he turned fear into a weapon, manipulating the hearts of a people already deeply afraid. The real horror of the Witchfinder General wasn't the women he accused, but the fact that he had the power to dictate life and death based on superstition and fear. His legacy remains a chilling reminder of how easily power can be abused and how fear can be weaponized to control and destroy lives. The true terror was not in his witch hunts, but in the fear they created, a fear that resonated long after the trials had ended. Witches and the flying powers. One of the most persistent myths about witches was that they could fly. Witches were often depicted as soaring through the night on broomsticks. Witches' flight was associated with their ability to move freely between the realms of the living and the dead. Flying was thought to be a symbol of their power over the natural world, and it was one of the most feared abilities attributed to witches during the witch hunts. But was this belief based on real experiences, or was it simply a projection of society's fear of women defying the natural order? The idea that witches could fly was likely rooted in hallucinatory experiences, often caused by the use of psychoactive substances like hallucinogenic herbs or mushrooms. Accused witches would sometimes confess to flying, even though there was no evidence to support the claim. The flying witch became a symbol of rebellion against authority, someone who could defy the laws of nature and travel freely in a world controlled by fear and superstition. Was the witch's flight real, or was it simply a manifestation of the fear of women with power? The fear of witches flying was less about the actual act of flight and more about what it represented: freedom, defiance, and the breaking of societal boundaries. The flying witch was a symbol of the unknown, a reminder of the fear that lies beneath the surface of society, waiting to surface whenever fear and superstition take hold. Witches and their cursed relics. Witches were often believed to possess cursed relics, objects that could bring harm, misfortune, or death to those who came into contact with them. These relics were said to hold the power of dark forces, such as enchanted mirrors, cursed books, or demonic talismans. The idea of a cursed object became one of the most terrifying aspects of witchcraft, as it symbolized the witch's ability to influence and control the world around them. But were these cursed relics real, or were they simply a projection of society's fear of the supernatural? The fear of witches and their cursed relics served to reinforce the idea that witches had power over life and death, able to curse objects and people with their dark magic. In some cases, the accused were believed to have used these relics to perform rituals or to cause harm. What if these relics were simply symbols of fear, objects used to project the idea of dark power, even though they were just ordinary, unremarkable items? The real horror of the witches' relics was not in the objects themselves, but in the way they amplified the fear that witches could control life and death with a mere trinket. The belief in cursed relics showed how easily people could turn everyday objects into symbols of terror, reflecting the deep fear of what could not be understood or controlled. Could the true curse lie not in the relics, but in the fear of the unknown they represented? Witch trials and economic interests. One of the lesser-known drivers behind many witch trials was the economic benefit they provided to those in power. Witch hunts often targeted marginalized members of society, such as the elderly or the poor, and their executions allowed their land and belongings to be seized. The trials were a way for the elite to eliminate competitors and enrich themselves, all while cloaking their actions in the guise of divine justice. But could the witch hunts have been more about wealth and control than about the pursuit of evil? Witch trials provided opportunities for land acquisition, as many of the accused witches were women without male protectors. Their estates and possessions were often seized by the accusers, who were quick to take advantage of the situation. In some cases, accusations of witchcraft were motivated purely by personal greed, with little concern for justice. The horror here lies in the exploitation of fear for material gain, using witchcraft as a convenient excuse to rob and destroy lives. This economic aspect of witch trials exposes the darker side of human nature, how fear and superstition can be manipulated to further personal agendas. What was truly terrifying wasn't just the trials, but the way in which they were used to enrich the powerful. Could it be that the witch hunts were not only about eradicating evil, but about exploiting a fear that could be monetized? Witch hunts in Finland. Finland, too, was not immune to the witch-hunting frenzy that gripped Europe during the early modern period. The Finnish witch hunts were particularly brutal, with women accused of consorting with the devil and causing misfortune through their dark magic. The most infamous of these trials occurred in the 17th century, where hundreds of people, many of them women, were executed. What was unique about Finland's witch hunts was their connection to a specific belief in the witch's ability to curse entire villages and cause widespread suffering. The fear of witches in Finland was not just about personal accusations, but about the idea that witches could destroy the prosperity of entire communities. The trials were rooted in a deep belief that the supernatural could influence everything from crop yields to the health of children. The idea that witches could manipulate natural forces to create harm became a terrifying and pervasive belief that spread through society. As in other parts of Europe, fear and suspicion drove the witch hunts, leaving a trail of death and destruction. But could it be that the true horror of Finland's witch trials wasn't just the executions, but the deep fear of what witches represented, a fear of nature, the unknown, and the power of women who could challenge the status quo? The witch's curse on the king. In many witch trials, it was believed that witches had the power to curse kings and monarchs. One of the most notorious cases of this occurred in 1560, when the French king Charles IX was allegedly cursed by a witch, leading to a series of misfortunes and ill health that plagued him for years. Witches who were believed to have cursed royalty were often executed, but the fear of such curses became a way to control and suppress dissent. Was the curse real, or was it simply a manifestation of the fear that society had of the supernatural's power over their rulers? The fear that a curse could affect a monarch was deeply rooted in the belief that witches could manipulate the balance of power. A curse wasn't just about causing harm, it was about challenging the very authority of the throne. The king, who was supposed to be the most powerful figure in the land, was reduced to a helpless victim of dark magic, symbolizing the fragility of power and the fear that it could be easily undone by forces beyond human control. The real horror of this curse wasn't just the suffering it caused the king, but in the way it revealed the vulnerability of rulers. It highlighted the fear that the balance of power could be toppled by a force as intangible and mysterious as a curse. Could the true fear be that no one, not even kings, were beyond the reach of witches and their supernatural influence? Witchcraft in ancient Europe. Witchcraft in ancient Europe was often intertwined with the natural world. Early European witches were believed to possess an intimate knowledge of herbs, healing, and the forces of nature. They were often seen as protectors of communities, using their knowledge of the natural world to heal the sick and ensure bountiful harvests. However, as Christianity spread throughout Europe, these practices became labelled as heretical, and those who practiced them were soon labelled witches. What if the real horror wasn't in witchcraft itself, but in the cultural shift that transformed a healer into a villain? In ancient Europe, witches were often women who had knowledge of medicinal plants, midwifery, and other aspects of natural life. They played an important role in their communities, offering guidance and healing. But as Christianity took hold, these women's roles began to shift. What had once been seen as the power of nature and wisdom became a threat, as witches were blamed for the misfortunes of the community. Was this shift in perception a sign of changing power dynamics, with women being pushed out of positions of influence? The real terror of ancient witchcraft wasn't just in the practices, it was in the fear of women who defied the growing religious and political structures. It was about the control of knowledge, and how quickly that control could be lost when superstition took hold. Could the true horror be the way society feared the wisdom and autonomy of women, transforming them into witches and threats to be destroyed? Witches and the Witchfinder. General. The witch trials in England were often driven by figures like Matthew Hopkins, the infamous Witchfinder General. Hopkins made a name for himself during the 17th century, leading witch hunts across East Anglia. He used methods of interrogation and torture that were both cruel and ruthless, earning a reputation as one of the most feared men in the country. His witch-finding was based on superstition and a complete lack of evidence, but his trials were carried out with the fervour of religious zealotry. Was Matthew Hopkins truly a man of faith, or was he a man who saw an opportunity for power and profit in the fear of witches? Hopkins' methods were brutal. He used sleep deprivation, physical abuse, and invasive searches to extract confessions from those he accused of witchcraft. Many of his victims were innocent, but the pressure of torture made them confess to crimes they had not committed. The terror of his witch hunts was not just in the executions, but in the way he used fear to manipulate the minds of the villagers. Was Hopkins a tool of divine retribution, or was he simply a man who used fear to become a powerful figure in a society steeped in superstition? Hopkins' legacy as a Witchfinder General serves as a chilling reminder of how easily fear can be manipulated to control and destroy lives. His actions set the stage for future witch hunts, and solidified his place in history as a figure who exploited the terror of witches for his own gain. The true horror of his witch hunts wasn't just in the deaths he caused, but in the way he turned fear into a weapon to be wielded at will. The Witch's Curse of Scotland. Scotland's witch trials were some of the most vicious in Europe, and they were often marked by the belief that witches had the power to place curses on entire towns. The witch's curse was not just a mark of supernatural power, it was a tool of terror, capable of wreaking havoc on families, crops, and livestock. In many cases, communities were consumed by fear, as the accusations of a curse spiraled into deadly witch hunts. What if the true terror of these curses wasn't in their supernatural power, but in the belief that anyone could be cursed, and the community's fear was its own destructive force. The fear of the witch's curse was deeply rooted in the belief that witches could manipulate the elements and bring about unnatural death. The cursed witch was a figure of terror, not just for her supposed abilities, but for the social and psychological havoc she could wreak. It was believed that a witch's curse could lead to disease, famine, or even death, and this was used to justify the most extreme methods of interrogation. Was the real horror in the curse itself, or was it in the terror it instilled in the hearts of the community? Ultimately, the fear of the witch's curse became a tool for social control, a weapon used to maintain power over communities. The true horror of these trials was not just in the deaths of the accused, but in the way fear could be used to manipulate and subjugate an entire population. Could the curse itself have been more of a psychological weapon, turning an entire society against its own? The witch's test. The touch test. The touch test was one of the most chilling practices during the witch trials, where an accused witch was made to touch the victim of her alleged curse. It was believed that if the witch's touch could heal or soothe the victim, she was guilty. But if the victim's suffering continued, the witch was considered innocent. This method was deeply flawed, relying on superstition and the manipulation of fear to make decisions that could end lives. What if the real terror of the touch test lay not in the test itself, but in the way it was used to validate fear and superstition as tools of control? The touch test was a cruel and manipulative practice. The victim's reaction to the touch, whether they felt relief or not, was believed to be proof of the witch's powers. This test was based on pure superstition, with no real evidence of guilt or innocence, and often led to wrongful accusations and executions. The true horror was not just in the test itself, but in the way it exploited the fear of witches to justify the most heinous acts. The touch test became a symbol of how easily fear could be manipulated, turning superstition into a tool for persecution. The real terror was not in the supposed magical powers of the accused, but in the way that fear of the supernatural could drive an entire community to turn on its own. Could the witch's true power lie in the fear she inspired, rather than in any actual magic? Witches and the flying powers. Witches were often believed to have the ability to fly, either on brooms, animals, or even through the air unaided. The belief that witches could fly was tied to their perceived ability to move between the realms of the living and the dead, and to transcend the natural world. Witches' flying powers were often seen as a direct affront to the laws of nature and divine order, fueling the fear and suspicion surrounding witchcraft. But what if this belief was less about actual flight, and more about the fear of women defying natural laws? The concept of witches flying on broomsticks has become an iconic symbol of witchcraft, but it was rooted in a deeply ingrained fear of women with power. Flying represented the ability to break free from the constraints of the earth and the social expectations placed on women. To the fearful minds of the time, the ability to fly was a terrifying symbol of rebellion, power, and autonomy. Were witches really flying, or was their flight a metaphor for their perceived ability to break free from societal control? The real horror of witches flying wasn't the supernatural act itself. It was the fear that women could break free from their assigned roles and wield power in a world that sought to control them. The witch's flight became a symbol of rebellion and freedom, a symbol that society could not understand and feared. Could it be that the true terror of witches flying was not in the act of flight, but in the way it symbolized women's power over their own fate? Witches and their accursed legacy. The legacy of witch trials and persecution has left a lasting mark on history, shaping both the perception of witches and the way society deals with fear and superstition. Many accused witches were women who had the knowledge and autonomy to stand apart from their communities. Their accursed legacy lies not just in the accusations of witchcraft, but in the way those accusations became a tool of social control, shaping communities through fear and distrust. Was it the witches who were the true danger, or was it the fear they inspired that became the most dangerous force of all? The result of personal vendettas, with people accusing their neighbours of witchcraft to settle old scores or gain control over land and property. Fear and paranoia played a critical role in fueling the witch hunts, turning neighbours into enemies and communities into bloodthirsty mobs. The real horror of the witch hunts was not just in the deaths of the accused, but in the way fear spread like wildfire, tearing apart the social fabric of entire communities. The legacy of the witch trials serves as a chilling reminder of how easily fear can take hold of a society, leading to the destruction of innocent lives. In the end, it wasn't just the witches who suffered, it was the entire community, torn apart by the hysteria. Could the real curse of the witch trials be the way they continue to haunt us today, a symbol of how easily fear can be used to manipulate and destroy? The Witchfinder. General, the end of an era, the rise of Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed Witchfinder General, marked the peak of the witch-hunting craze in England. Known for his relentless pursuit of witches, Hopkins is credited with executing over 100 people during his reign of terror. His methods, torture, forced confessions, and the targeting of the most vulnerable members of society have earned him a place in history as one of the most infamous figures in witchcraft persecution. But could Hopkins' rise to power have been fueled more by ambition and the desire for fame than by a true belief in witchcraft? Hopkins' methods were extreme, and he was known for using fear and superstition to fuel his witch hunts. He claimed to have divine authority to root out witches, yet his motives seemed more self-serving than righteous. Hopkins was not just a witch hunter, he was a symbol of how fear could be manipulated to gain power. The true horror of Hopkins wasn't in the witches he condemned, but in the way he used fear as a tool of manipulation. The legacy of Hopkins continues to haunt the history of witch trials. His reign marked the end of an era in which witch hunting was used as a means of social control, but it also left a lasting scar on the psyche of society. Could the true terror of the Witchfinder General lie not just in his methods, but in the way he capitalized on the power of fear to dominate and destroy? The Witch's Trial, the Swimming Test. One of the most infamous and horrifying tests used during witch trials was the swimming test. The accused witch would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. It was believed that witches, having rejected God, would float because water, a symbol of purity, would refuse to accept them. If the person sank, they were considered innocent, though this often meant death by drowning. If they floated, they were deemed guilty and would be executed. The swimming test exemplified the twisted logic of witch hunts, where death was a likely outcome regardless of the test result. The swimming test wasn't just an attempt to prove guilt, it was a spectacle of fear, designed to humiliate and torment the accused before their death. It was a public display, where the community would gather to witness the supposed power of a witchcraft. The trial was more about the terror of the unknown and the need to punish what couldn't be understood. Could the true horror of the swimming test lie not in the outcome, but in the social ritual of watching a person be subjected to this cruel fate? The swimming test ultimately symbolized how fear could override reason, turning a simple water test into a deadly form of ritual. The question remains, was it the witch who was the true victim, or was it the entire community, ensnared by the overwhelming fear of the unknown? Could it be that the swimming test didn't reveal witches, but instead reflected society's own inner terror? The witch's test, the pricking method. Another infamous method used to determine a witch's guilt was the pricking test. In this trial, the accused witch was searched for a devil's mark, a spot on the body that supposedly couldn't feel pain. The idea was that if a needle or pin was inserted into this mark, the witch wouldn't flinch. In reality, the pricking was a form of torture, designed to elicit confessions or force physical reactions. The pricking test exemplified the absurdity of the witch hunts, accusations based on fear, superstition, and the manipulation of pain. The pricking method became a symbol of the horrific lengths people would go to in order to prove guilt. In many cases, these marks were fabricated or exaggerated, and innocent people were tortured based on little more than superstition. The real terror wasn't just the physical pain of the pricking, but in the way it validated false accusations and reinforced the belief that fear could be manipulated for justice. The pricking test was another example of how the witch hunts were driven by fear, and how the boundaries of reason and justice were stretched beyond recognition. The horror of this test lies not just in the physical pain, but in the way it turned people into objects of terror. Could the true terror of the pricking method lie not in the mark itself, but in the fear that it could be used to condemn an innocent soul? Witch trials in Iceland. Iceland, isolated and steeped in folklore, was not immune to the witch trials that plagued Europe. The trials there were particularly brutal, with accusations of witchcraft often tied to social or economic disputes. The fear of witches in Iceland was deeply intertwined with the land's rugged, unforgiving nature, where the harshness of the environment seemed to give rise to the belief that supernatural forces could dominate the natural world. What if the fear of witches in Iceland wasn't just about magic, but about the struggle between the elements and the human desire to control them? In the Icelandic trials, women accused of witchcraft were often targeted for their knowledge of herbs and healing, and their supposed ability to control the elements. The trials were a reflection of the fear that people had of the natural world, of forces beyond their control. In a society that depended on the land for survival, the idea that a woman could command nature was seen as both an affront and a danger. The true horror of the Icelandic witch trials wasn't just the executions, it was the fear of nature itself. The idea that witches could control the forces of life and death reflected the anxiety people felt in such a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Could the real terror of the witch trials in Iceland be the fear that nature itself could not be controlled, and that those who wielded power over it could destroy society? Witchcraft and the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is perhaps one of the most notorious institutions associated with the hunt for witches. While it is often remembered for its role in rooting out heresy, the Inquisition also became a tool for prosecuting witches, especially in Spain and the Spanish colonies. The Inquisition used torture to extract confessions from those accused of witchcraft, and the trials were marked by brutality. But what if the Inquisition's fear of witchcraft wasn't just about protecting faith, but about controlling a society that was beginning to challenge its traditional structures? The Inquisition's approach to witchcraft trials was methodical and ruthless. Accused witches were often forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit, their words twisted and manipulated by their torturers. The Inquisition's methods reflected the deep fear that witches were not just a threat to the church but to the very fabric of society. In the Inquisition's mind, witches embodied everything that was unholy and rebellious, and they had to be eradicated at all costs. The real horror of the Inquisition's witch hunts wasn't just in the death toll, but in the way fear and superstition were weaponized by those in power. The Inquisition wasn't just about rooting out heresy, it was about maintaining control over a world that was increasingly becoming harder to govern. Could the true terror of the Inquisition's witch hunts be found in the way they used fear as a tool to silence dissent and consolidate power? The last witch burned in England. The last woman to be executed for witchcraft in England was in 1684, a tragic end to centuries of witch hunts that had begun in the medieval period. This final execution occurred just as the Enlightenment was beginning to challenge old superstitions and religious dogma. The trial and execution of the last witch burned in England symbolized the end of an era, one where fear, ignorance, and the desire to control the supernatural had caused the deaths of countless innocents. But how much of the witch hunts was about actual belief in magic, and how much was it about a society's need to find scapegoats? The last witch trials in England occurred in an era where science and reason were beginning to challenge the beliefs that had once fueled the witch hunts. The execution of the final witch was symbolic of a society that was slowly realizing the absurdity of its old fears. But the real horror wasn't just in the burning of the last witch, it was in the thousands who had been executed before her, all victims of a society that had allowed fear to dictate its actions. The legacy of the last witch burned in England serves as a grim reminder of how easily fear can lead to atrocities. The witch trials were not just about the persecution of witches, they were about how societies can be manipulated by fear and superstition. Was the burning of the last witch truly the end of an era, or was it just the beginning of a deeper, more insidious form of fear that still lingers today? 66. Witchcraft and the power of the unseen. Witchcraft has long been associated with the unseen forces of nature, the hidden energies that govern the world. Witches were believed to possess the ability to tap into these powers, manipulating the elements and the fabric of reality itself. These unseen forces were feared because they were not understood, and witches were seen as the conduits to these forces. But what if the true power of witches wasn't in their ability to control the elements, but in the fear they inspired about the unknown. The fear of witches was often linked to the fear of the unseen, of forces that could not be seen, touched, or explained. These were the forces that governed nature, life, and death, and witches were believed to have the ability to tap into them at will. In this way, witches were more than just magical beings. They were symbols of the fear of the unknown, the unseen forces that could not be controlled. Could the real horror of witchcraft lie not in the powers witches were believed to possess, but in the terrifying idea that there were forces in the world that could not be explained? Witches were feared not just because of their alleged powers, but because they represented the unknown, the uncontrollable. The terror of witches was rooted in the anxiety about what lay beyond human understanding. The true power of witchcraft may have been less about magic, and more about the fear of what we cannot comprehend. Could the witches have been feared not for their ability to control the unseen, but for the very fact that they represented everything we could not explain or control? Witches and the fear of women's power. Witch trials were often deeply gendered, with women being the primary targets of witchcraft accusations. Women were accused of witchcraft not only for their supposed magical powers, but also for their perceived ability to subvert the natural order. The witch hunt reflected society's deep-seated fear of women's power, especially women who stepped outside traditional roles. Was the real fear behind the witch trials the belief that women could not only heal and control nature, but also break free from the constraints of patriarchal society? The association of women with witchcraft was rooted in the idea that they had an innate connection to nature, the mystical, and the unknown. Witches were often portrayed as powerful women who could bend the natural world to their will. But this power was also feared because it was seen as disruptive to the established order. Women who refused to conform to societal expectations, whether through their knowledge, independence, or rejection of male authority, were often accused of witchcraft. The real horror of witchcraft wasn't the magic. It was the fear that women who wielded power over life and death could challenge the status quo. Witches were symbols of rebellion and defiance, figures who represented the fear that women could control their own fate. Could it be that the witch hunts were less about magic and more about the terror of women who refused to be controlled? Witches and the Devil's Black Sabbath. The Witches' Sabbath, or the Black Sabbath, was believed to be a secret gathering of witches where they would worship the devil and perform unspeakable rituals. These gatherings were associated with acts of blasphemy, child sacrifice, and dark magic. The fear of the witches' Sabbath was one of the driving forces behind many witch hunts, as it was believed that witches were not only defying God, but engaging in rituals that threatened the very fabric of society. But what if the Sabbath was not real, but merely a manifestation of the fear of rebellion and the desire to control the unknown? The witches' Sabbath was often described as a meeting of witches where they would partake in unspeakable acts, such as feasting on human flesh, cursing their enemies, and summoning demons. These rituals were thought to grant witches power over life and death, but they were also seen as acts of rebellion against the divine order. Could it be that the fear of the Sabbath wasn't based on any real act, but on the fear of a society where the established order could be broken and replaced by forces outside of human control? The real horror of the witches' Sabbath was not in the rituals themselves, but in what they represented. The fear of a world where society's boundaries could be crossed and the natural order could be undone. The witches' Sabbath embodied the terror of rebellion and the potential for chaos. Could the true terror of these gatherings lie not in the rituals, but in the way they symbolized the fear of losing control over both the natural and supernatural worlds? The Witch Trials of Würzburg. The Witch Trials of Würzburg, one of the largest and most brutal witch hunts in history, took place in the Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg during the 17th century. Led by the zealot Bishop Philip Adolf of Ehrenberg, these trials were marked by extreme torture and countless executions. Between 1626 and 1631, more than 900 people were accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake, making it one of the deadliest witch hunts in history. The fear of witches in Würzburg was a symptom of a much deeper religious and social crisis, where fear of the devil and the desire for control created a cycle of destruction. The Würzburg trials were not just about witchcraft. They were about consolidating power in the face of social unrest. The trials were fueled by both religious zeal and political ambition, with the bishop using the witch hunts to tighten his grip on the region. The terror wasn't just about the executions, it was about how fear of witchcraft was used as a tool to maintain control in a time of crisis. Could the true horror of the Würzburg trials lie in the way they exploited fear for political gain? The legacy of the Würzburg witch trials serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria. The trials showed how easily fear and superstition could be manipulated to destroy lives, especially in times of political instability. The real horror wasn't in the witches themselves, but in how society allowed its fears to be weaponized, leading to the destruction of an entire community. Witches and the fear of heresy. In many parts of Europe, witchcraft was not only feared because of its supposed magical powers, but because it was also seen as heresy, an offence against the Christian faith. Accused witches were often portrayed as enemies of the church, agents of the devil who sought to corrupt the soul and lead others astray. This connection between witchcraft and heresy made witch hunts particularly dangerous, as they became intertwined with religious purity. But was the fear of heresy really about magic, or was it about controlling the growing religious and philosophical dissent of the time? The fear of heresy went hand in hand with the fear of witchcraft, as witches were believed to be practitioners of forbidden knowledge that could undermine the church's authority. In many cases, accusations of witchcraft were actually veiled attacks on women or men who threatened the established religious order. The witch trials, then, became a tool for maintaining the power of the church, using fear of heresy as a justification for persecution. The true horror of the witch trials wasn't just in the accusation of heresy, it was in how fear of religious dissent turned into a tool of control and destruction. The witch hunt became a means to eliminate those who refused to conform, who questioned authority, or who simply sought knowledge outside of the church's teachings. Could the true terror be that the trials were not just about witches, but about the broader fear of losing control over religion and society? Witchcraft and the burning of children. One of the most disturbing accusations in witch trials was the belief that witches had the power to harm children. Witches were often accused of kidnapping and killing children, sometimes in ritualistic sacrifices to the devil. These horrific claims were based on fears of witches' powers over life and death, and they tapped into society's deepest anxieties about the most vulnerable members of society. What if the true terror wasn't the witches' abilities, but the deep fear of losing control over the protection of children and the innocence of youth? The fear of witches harming children was amplified by the belief that witches could manipulate the life force of the innocent. Children, seen as pure and vulnerable, became the prime targets of these accusations. The idea that witches could steal away the soul of a child or sacrifice them for dark purposes was a source of intense fear. But was it possible that these accusations were a reflection of society's anxiety about the vulnerability of children and its inability to protect them from a world filled with darkness and evil? The true horror wasn't just in the deaths of the children, but in the way these accusations were used to manipulate the fears of the populace. The belief that witches could harm children allowed the powers that be to use fear as a tool to control and eliminate perceived threats. Could the real terror lie not in the witches themselves, but in the way fear was used to target the most vulnerable members of society? The Witches of Wexford. The Witches of Wexford were part of a series of witch trials that took place in Ireland during the 17th century. Accusations of witchcraft were often made against women who were thought to have supernatural powers. In Wexford, the fear of witches escalated as accusations of evil practices became widespread, leading to trials and executions. But were these accusations driven by real supernatural fear, or were they the result of political and religious tensions in Ireland during a time of great upheaval? The Wexford trials were marked by the fear of both witchcraft and the rise of Catholic power in Ireland. The trials were used as a means to punish women who were seen as threatening the religious and political order of the time. These trials were not just about witchcraft. They were about control, power, and the fear of rebellion. Was the true horror of the Wexford trials in the witchcraft accusations themselves, or was it about the way they were used to suppress dissent? The Wexford Witch Trials were a reflection of how fear of the supernatural could be manipulated to control populations, especially during times of political or religious unrest. Could the real terror of these trials lie in the way fear of witches was used as a tool to consolidate power and destroy those deemed dangerous? Witches and the unseen, forces of nature. Witches were believed to possess the ability to manipulate the natural world in ways that defied human understanding. From controlling the weather to causing crops to fail, witches were often accused of using their powers to bend nature to their will. But what if the true terror of witches wasn't in their control over nature, but in the fear that they represented the unknown forces that humans had no control over? The fear of witches' ability to control the natural world was rooted in the idea that witches were able to wield powers that were beyond human comprehension. If they could control the weather, cause crops to wither, or even bring about the death of animals, then they were seen as dangerous forces to be feared. But what if witches didn't actually have the power to control nature, but were instead symbols of the forces of nature that were beyond understanding? The real horror of witches was not in their ability to control nature, but in the fear that they represented the vast, uncontrollable forces that lay beyond human comprehension. Could the true terror of witchcraft be found in the way it exposed humanity's inability to dominate the natural world and harness the forces that governed life itself? The witch's curse and the king's death. In medieval Europe, it was widely believed that witches had the power to curse kings and monarchs, causing death or misfortune to fall upon them. A chilling example of this belief can be seen in the case of King Charles VI of France, whose reign was marred by illness and madness, leading some to accuse witches of placing a curse upon him. The king's condition was believed to be a sign of the devil's influence, and many thought his insanity was the result of witchcraft. But what if this curse wasn't the work of witches, but a manifestation of fear about the loss of royal power? The belief that witches could bring about the death of kings was more than just superstition. It was a reflection of the belief that monarchs were divinely appointed and invincible. The idea that witches could challenge the authority of the king by causing his downfall was a terrifying thought. But was the king's death truly caused by witchcraft, or was it the result of his physical and mental decline made all the more terrifying by the fears surrounding witchcraft? The real horror of this curse was not in the power of witches, but in the belief that a single force, real or imagined, could unravel the stability of a kingdom. Could it be that the true terror lay not in the king's downfall, but in the way that fear of witches could threaten the very foundation of power itself? Witches and the fear of the unseen forces. Witch trials were not just about accusing individuals of magical practices, they were also about the fear of unseen supernatural forces. Witches were believed to control forces that could not be seen or understood, forces that influenced life, death, and the natural world. These forces were feared because they challenged the very idea of order and control. But what if the real fear was not the witches themselves, but the fear of what lay beyond human understanding, the invisible powers that seem to govern the world? The fear of the unseen is a powerful force, and it lies at the heart of many witch trials. Witches were believed to wield the power to manipulate these hidden forces, and this belief turned witches into symbols of fear and the unknown. The terror wasn't just about what witches could do, it was about the fear of what they represented, an uncontrollable, invisible power that could bring about death, disaster, and despair. The real horror of witchcraft was not in the magic itself, but in the idea that there were forces beyond human control, forces that could not be seen, explained, or contained. Could it be that the true terror of the witch trials lay in the way they tapped into humanity's deepest fears of the unknown, the invisible forces that shape our world without our understanding? Witches and their cursed relics. Throughout history, witches were believed to possess cursed relics, objects that could bring harm, misfortune, or death to those who came into contact with them. These relics were said to hold the power of dark forces, such as enchanted mirrors, cursed books, or demonic talismans. The fear of these relics grew during the witch trials as they became synonymous with a witch's supposed power to affect the lives of others. But what if the real horror wasn't in these objects, but in the way they became symbols of fear, transforming everyday items into instruments of terror? The cursed relics attributed to witches were often believed to be physical manifestations of their power, objects that held an otherworldly influence. From the Devil's Book to a talisman believed to ward off evil, these objects were thought to channel dark energy. The real horror lay not in the objects themselves, but in the power they held over the minds of those who believed in their curse. Could the relics have been ordinary objects manipulated by fear, or were they truly vessels of dark power, capable of harming those who came near them? The relics became symbols of the witch's influence, representing the fear of something unseen and beyond comprehension. The true terror wasn't the relics, but in how they represented humanity's deep-seated fear of the unknown and the supernatural. Could the cursed relics be the true reflection of society's fear, an embodiment of the things it couldn't control or understand? Witches and the fear of the Devil's Mark. The Devil's Mark was a key element in many witch trials, with witches accused of bearing a mark on their bodies that was supposedly proof of their pact with the devil. This mark was believed to be a physical manifestation of the witch's allegiance to dark forces, and it could appear as a mole, a blemish, or even a birthmark. Accused witches were subjected to intense scrutiny, with their bodies examined for signs of this mark, and in some cases, the mark was discovered through torture. What if the true horror of the Devil's Mark wasn't the mark itself, but the belief that something so ordinary could be turned into evidence of evil? The Devil's Mark represented the fear of the invisible, the unseen forces that could corrupt and destroy. It was used as a means of identifying witches, with the mark seen as a symbol of their connection to dark powers. The real horror wasn't just in the accusation, it was in the way the mark could be fabricated, manipulated, or found, in the most innocuous places. Could the Devil's Mark have been a way to justify persecution, a tool for using fear to control those who were different or marginalized? The real terror of the Devil's Mark was not the mark itself, but the way it became a symbol of societal fear. The mark was a symbol of a woman's power, of her supposed connection to the supernatural and to forces beyond human understanding. Could the fear of the Devil's Mark lie not in its existence, but in the way it gave society permission to view the accused as dangerous, even monstrous? The Witches of East Anglia. East Anglia was home to some of the most notorious witch trials in England, and it became a hotbed of witchcraft hysteria in the 16th and 17th centuries. The region's witch hunts were fueled by religious zeal, fear of rebellion, and a growing paranoia that witches were conspiring against both God and the monarch. The trials were marked by confessions obtained through torture, and many innocent lives were destroyed. What if the fear of witches in East Anglia wasn't just about witchcraft, but about the larger social upheaval that was occurring in England at the time? The witch trials in East Anglia were driven by the fear of the unknown and the fear of those who could challenge authority. The trials became an outlet for societal anxiety, targeting women who were perceived as threats. These trials weren't just about rooting out witches, they were about rooting out those who defied the norms of a society in turmoil. Was the real horror of these trials about witchcraft, or about the fear of change and rebellion that was sweeping through the land? The East Anglia witch trials left behind a dark legacy of fear, repression, and violence. The real terror wasn't in the accusations themselves, but in the way fear was used to target the vulnerable, to destroy lives, and to enforce conformity. Could it be that the trials were less about witches and more about a society unable to cope with the chaos and change that was happening all around them? The curse of the witch's kiss. One of the most chilling beliefs surrounding witches was that their kiss could bring about a curse, often a death sentence. The idea was that witches would mark their victims with a kiss that would leave them cursed, leading to a slow and painful death. This belief was rooted in the idea that the witch's kiss was the seal of the devil's pact, transferring the curse directly from the witch to the victim. But what if the real horror of the witch's kiss wasn't in the curse itself, but in the fear that it symbolized? Fear of touch, intimacy, and the loss of control. The witch's kiss became a symbol of how fear of intimacy and closeness could manifest in the darkest corners of society. To be kissed by a witch was to be marked for death, an intimate, unholy exchange that was believed to bring about great suffering. This belief reflected the fear of power over the body over life itself and the terror of being touched by something considered unnatural and evil? Could the real horror of the witch's kiss lie not in the curse it brought, but in the fear of losing control over one's body? The witch's kiss became a symbol of both intimacy and violence, a dark representation of society's fear of the power witches held over the lives and bodies of others. Was it the kiss that was terrifying, or the idea that such an intimate act could be the harbinger of doom? Witches and the fear of rebellion. Witchcraft has long been associated with rebellion, not just against religious authority, but also against the rigid structures of society. Witches were often accused of engaging in subversive acts, from defying gender roles to resisting societal expectations. The fear of rebellion, of losing control over the established order, fueled the persecution of witches. Was the true horror of witchcraft the magic itself, or was it the witch's refusal to conform, her ability to break free from the constraints of society? Witches were often viewed as a challenge to the established power structures, whether religious, political, or social. They were women who stood outside the norms of their time, wielding power in ways that threatened the order of things. The real terror of witchcraft was not in the magic, but in the idea that witches could live free of society's constraints. Could the true fear lie in the witches' rebellion, in the idea that women could have power over their own lives? The witch trials were not just about hunting down witches, they were about hunting down rebellion. The fear of witches was a fear of losing control, of allowing individuals to break free from the strictures of society. Could it be that the witch trials were not just about magic, but about the fear of rebellion itself? The witch's curse on the town. In many witch trials, witches were accused of placing curses on entire towns. These curses were believed to bring about disasters, plagues, famines, or even entire villages being struck down by mysterious illnesses. The witches were seen as capable of turning the elements, nature, and even divine punishment against the community. What if the real terror of these curses was not in the supernatural powers of witches, but in the way society could believe that an entire town's suffering could be blamed on a single person? The belief that witches could curse towns reflects humanity's deep fear of being powerless against larger forces. If witches could manipulate fate itself, then entire communities could be condemned to suffer. The horror wasn't just in the curses themselves, but in the idea that the forces of nature could be turned against the innocent. Could the true fear have been that anyone could be blamed for the misfortune that befell a town, and how easily fear could spread throughout a community? The real horror of these witch hunts wasn't just the destruction of witches, it was in the way they symbolized the community's fear of the unknown and their inability to control fate. What if the true terror was not in the curse itself, but in the way that fear could tear apart entire villages, leaving behind only suspicion, hate, and loss? Witchcraft and the evil eye. The evil eye was a powerful belief in many cultures, where it was believed that a person could cast a curse upon others simply by looking at them with malice or jealousy. Witches were often accused of possessing the power of the evil eye, enabling them to cause illness, bad luck, or misfortune. This belief in the evil eye added another layer of terror to witch trials, as it was a subtle form of witchcraft that could affect anyone, at any time. But what if the true horror of the evil eye wasn't in the curse itself, but in the belief that a single evil look could change a life forever? The evil eye wasn't just about causing harm, it was about fear, jealousy, and the belief that one person's gaze could hold such power. Witches who were accused of possessing the evil eye were thought to have the ability to curse with nothing more than a glance. The real terror wasn't in the curse, but in the fear that someone could be capable of wielding such power without even lifting a finger. Could it be that the fear of the evil eye was less about magic and more about how suspicion and envy could change the course of one's life? The belief in the evil eye reflects the deep fear of the unknown and the uncontrollable. It wasn't just about magic, it was about how fear of something as invisible as a glance could disrupt lives and create chaos. Could the true terror of the evil eye be in the power of perception itself, and the way it could turn anyone into a potential target of suspicion? Witch Trials in Finland, a tale of fear and misfortune. In Finland, the witch trials were marked by a blend of superstition and fear of the supernatural. Witches were believed to possess the ability to control nature, curse people, and even bring about famine and death. The trials were particularly brutal, with many accused witches subjected to extreme torture in an attempt to extract confessions. But what if the true horror of the Finnish witch trials wasn't just in the belief of witches' powers, but in how fear could spread across an entire society, leading to widespread hysteria? The Finnish witch trials were not isolated incidents. They were part of a wider wave of witch hunts across Europe, fueled by religious and social anxiety. The accusations were often based on personal grievances, jealousy, or the fear of the unknown. The trials were an expression of society's attempt to maintain control over forces it couldn't understand. Was the real horror of the trials not in the witches, but in how fear of the supernatural turned an entire community into a mob of accusers and executioners? The true terror of the Finnish witch trials lay not just in the death of the accused, but in the way these trials represented the breakdown of reason and the rise of irrational fear. Could the horror be found in how quickly fear of witchcraft spread, affecting entire villages and leading to the persecution of those who were different? The witches' last words. Before being executed, many accused witches were asked to speak their last words. These final statements often became part of the folklore surrounding their trials, with some witches cursing their accusers or claiming innocence until the very end. The last words of a witch were seen as a powerful reflection of their soul, a final plea for justice, or a mark of defiance against the powers that had condemned them. But what if the real horror wasn't in the words they spoke, but in how their words continued to haunt those who believed in their powers? The witches' last words were often used to further perpetuate the myth of their evil, or to solidify their role as martyrs in the eyes of their supporters. In some cases, these words were seen as proof of the witches' power, as if their final breath could curse or bless. The real horror lay not in the words themselves, but in the way they transformed the witch into a symbol, whether of evil or of rebellion against the system. The true terror of the witch's last words wasn't just in the cursing or pleading, it was in the way these words lived on, becoming part of the story of witchcraft that haunted communities for generations. Could the horror lie in how these final words could transcend the execution, creating a lasting legacy of fear and suspicion? The execution of witches in Europe. The execution of witches was often a public event, designed not only to punish the accused but to serve as a warning to others. Burning at the stake was the most common method of execution, but witches were also hanged, drowned, or beheaded. The executions were marked by brutal violence and often served as a grotesque form of entertainment for the masses. But what if the true horror wasn't in the executions themselves, but in the way they became a symbol of society's desperate need for control and its willingness to sacrifice individuals for fear? The executions of witches were often public spectacles, with entire towns gathering to watch the condemned be put to death. These events were intended to demonstrate the power of the authorities and to send a message to the community about the dangers of witchcraft. The horror wasn't just in the executions, but in the way they were used to reinforce social norms and create an atmosphere of fear. Could the true terror lie in the way these public executions reflected the darker aspects of human nature? The executions were not just about punishing witches, they were a tool for enforcing conformity and control. The real horror wasn't in the deaths themselves, but in how they symbolized a society willing to sacrifice the innocent to preserve its own sense of order. Could the true terror be found not in the witch hunts, but in the way fear could shape a society's willingness to destroy those who were different? The Witchfinder General's search for evidence. Matthew Hopkins, the infamous Witchfinder General, was notorious for his relentless pursuit of witches across East Anglia. Hopkins' methods for finding evidence of witchcraft were disturbingly unscientific, relying on torture, forced confessions, and the search for witches' marks. His search for evidence often resulted in the deaths of innocent people, and he justified his actions through a supposed divine mandate. But what if the real terror lay not in the supposed power of the witches, but in how easily fear could be manipulated to validate false accusations? Hopkins' search for evidence was not about uncovering the truth. It was about confirming his own beliefs and justifying his pursuit of power. Evidence was twisted and manipulated to fit the narrative of witchcraft, with accused witches often forced to confess under duress. The true horror of this search wasn't in the witches themselves, but in how it demonstrated how easily people could be manipulated by fear to justify mass persecution. The search for evidence during the witch trials became a grotesque ritual that perpetuated fear and suspicion. The real terror was not in the accusations themselves, but in the way they tore apart communities, turning neighbours against each other in the name of finding witches. Could the true horror lie not in the witch trials, but in how the search for evidence became a weapon of social control? The witch's curse on the family line, one of the darkest elements of witchcraft accusations, was the belief that witches could place a curse on a family, condemning generations to suffer. These curses were believed to carry through bloodlines, causing misfortune, illness, and death for generations. The witch's curse became a powerful symbol of the fear of inheritance, fear that the sins of one person could be passed down through their descendants. But what if the true horror of these curses wasn't in their supernatural power, but in the way they reflected society's obsession with bloodlines and control over family legacies? The belief in family curses was often rooted in superstition and fear of ancestral retribution. In many cases, individuals accused of witchcraft were believed to have cursed their entire bloodline, bringing death and suffering to their descendants. The horror wasn't just in the curse itself, but in how it symbolized the fear that one person's actions could affect generations to come. Could the real terror of these curses lie in the way they perpetuated a cycle of fear and suffering across bloodlines, creating an unending chain of destruction? The curse of the family line became a symbol of the fear of hereditary destiny. It wasn't just the individual who was feared, it was the idea that the sins of the past could haunt future generations. Could the real horror of these curses lie in the belief that the sins of one could never be washed away and the damage would persist through time? The witch's power over animals. Throughout witch trials, it was believed that witches could control animals, particularly familiar spirits, creatures that witches were said to summon to do their bidding. These familiars, often in the form of cats, dogs, or even toads, were seen as the witch's connection to the supernatural world. The fear of witches controlling animals was not just about their power over the creatures themselves, but about what these familiars represented: unnatural influence over the natural world. But what if the real horror wasn't in the witch's control over animals, but in the way that fear distorted the relationship between humans and animals? Familiars were often seen as the witch's servants, able to perform tasks, deliver curses, and even act as spies for their masters. These creatures were feared because they were believed to be unnatural, imbued with dark magic that defied the laws of nature. The idea that a witch could control an animal was a symbol of her power to manipulate the world around her, and it added another layer of terror to the witch's influence. Could the real horror of witchcraft be found not in the witch's powers over animals, but in the way society's fear of control was reflected in these beliefs? The fear of witches controlling animals was rooted in the belief that they could manipulate life itself, bending the natural world to their will. But the real horror lay not in the control over animals. It was in the belief that anything, even the forces of nature, could be twisted and used for dark purposes. Could the true terror lie not in the supernatural powers witches were believed to possess, but in how easily fear could turn animals, once seen as companions, into symbols of evil and control? The Last Witch Hunt in Europe. The last witch hunt in Europe took place in the late 18th century, just as the Enlightenment was spreading across the continent. In the small town of Poligny, France, the final witch trial saw the execution of 2 women accused of witchcraft. This event marked the end of a dark era in which superstition and fear dominated Europe's view of the supernatural. But what if the last witch hunt wasn't the end of witchcraft hysteria, but rather a turning point in the way society came to understand fear and the supernatural? The last witch hunt symbolized the decline of witchcraft accusations as scientific and rational thought began to take hold. The Enlightenment, with its focus on reason and evidence, began to challenge the deeply ingrained belief in witchcraft, leading to the eventual abolition of the witch hunts. However, this was not an immediate or universal change, and the witch trials still held sway in some parts of Europe for years after. Was the true horror not in the trials themselves, but in how long the fear of witches persisted, even into the modern age? The legacy of the last witch hunt serves as a reminder of how easily societies can be swept up in fear, even when reason and knowledge should prevail. The real terror wasn't just in the deaths of the accused, it was in how fear and superstition continued to shape societies long after they should have been abandoned. Could the true horror be in the way that fear can endure, influencing even the most enlightened minds long after the witch trials had ended? Witches and their magical herbs. Witches were often believed to possess knowledge of magical herbs and potions that could heal, curse, or even summon spirits. These herbs were seen as both a blessing and a curse, tools of both healing and destruction. The belief in witches' power over herbs and their ability to concoct potions added a terrifying dimension to witchcraft, as it was thought that witches could use nature's own gifts to do unspeakable harm. But what if the real terror of witches and their herbs wasn't in their magical properties, but in how these natural substances were perceived as gateways to the supernatural? The fear surrounding magical herbs was rooted in the belief that witches could control life and death through the use of plants that grew in the wild. Many witches were skilled herbalists, and their knowledge was seen as both a gift and a threat. The real horror of these herbs wasn't just in their supposed magical properties, it was in the fear that these natural remedies could be used for harm, and that the boundary between healing and cursing was dangerously thin. The legacy of witches and their herbs highlights society's fear of the natural world and its untapped powers. It wasn't the herbs themselves, but the way they represented the unknown that terrified people. Could the true terror of these witches' magical herbs lie in the way society's fears were projected onto the natural world, turning harmless plants into symbols of evil? Witches and the fear of power. The witch trials were often driven by a deep-seated fear of women who held power, whether it was the power to heal, to control nature, or even to influence the lives of others. Witches were often seen as powerful figures who could manipulate reality to their will, and this was terrifying to a society that believed in rigid gender roles. The true fear wasn't just in the witches' powers, but in the fear that women could break free from the constraints of their societal roles and become forces to be reckoned with. The idea of women wielding power was threatening to the patriarchal structures of the time, and witches were often portrayed as rebellious figures who defied these structures. Whether through their knowledge of herbs, their ability to heal, or their perceived connection to dark forces, witches were seen as women who refused to conform. The real horror lay not in the magic they were believed to possess, but in the way their very existence challenged the established order. The witch trials were a manifestation of society's fear of women who held power, fear of women who stepped outside the boundaries of their prescribed roles. Could the true horror of these trials lie in the way women's power was demonized and used as a justification for persecution? Was the real terror in the witch's power, or in society's fear of losing control over women's autonomy? The Witchfinder General's financial motive. Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witchfinder General, was not only driven by zealotry but also by financial gain. He was paid handsomely for each witch he found and brought to trial, and the fear of witchcraft became a lucrative business for him. The financial rewards of witch hunts became an alarming part of their motivation, as people saw an opportunity to profit from fear. Was the true horror of the witch trials less about religious fervour and more about the greed and corruption that manipulated the public's fears for personal gain? Hopkins' financial interest in the trials led him to accuse more and more people of witchcraft. Inflating the scale of the hysteria, the accusations became a means of gaining power, wealth, and influence, turning a witch hunt into a profitable business. The fear of witches and the terror of the unknown became commodities, used to fuel a system of exploitation and manipulation. Was the true terror of these trials in the witchcraft itself, or in the way they were used to line the pockets of the powerful? The witch hunts, which were meant to rid society of evil, were distorted into a tool of power and personal profit. The legacy of Hopkins reveals the way that fear can be manipulated for financial gain, and how easily it can be twisted to serve the interests of those who control the narrative. Could the real horror lie in the way fear can be exploited for personal profit, and the way those who are vulnerable become pawns in a game of greed? The witch's pact with the devil. The idea that witches made pacts with the devil was one of the most terrifying elements of the witch trials. It was believed that witches gave their souls to the devil in exchange for power, wealth, or magical abilities. These pacts were seen as the ultimate betrayal of God and were often used as the justification for brutal executions. But what if the real horror of these pacts wasn't in the witch's supposed relationship with the devil, but in the way this belief fueled persecution, turning the idea of a pact into a tool for societal control? The belief that witches made pacts with the devil was rooted in the fear that they could wield dark powers, but it also reflected a deep-seated anxiety about the loss of control. The pact was seen as the ultimate sin, a voluntary surrender of one's soul to evil forces. In many cases, the fear of witchcraft was less about magic, and more about the fear of losing control over the soul and the ability to protect society from malevolent forces. The real horror of the witches' pacts was not in their relationship with the devil, but in how these pacts symbolized a fear of losing one's soul to forces beyond comprehension. The witch trials were a manifestation of a society's fear of what it couldn't understand or control. Could the true terror lie in how the belief in these pacts revealed the deep anxiety people had about the boundaries between good and evil? Witches, and the fear of the supernatural witchcraft was inherently linked to the supernatural, with witches believed to possess the ability to transcend the boundaries of the natural world. They were accused of communicating with spirits, summoning demons, and manipulating forces beyond human understanding. The fear of witches wasn't just about their magical abilities, it was about the fear of the unknown, the supernatural forces that could not be seen or controlled. What if the real horror of witchcraft wasn't in the magic, but in the fear of what lurked just beyond human comprehension? The supernatural powers attributed to witches were a reflection of society's deep fear of the unknown. Witches were seen as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual realms with the ability to manipulate both. The real terror was not just in what witches could do, but in how the supernatural was used to explain events that couldn't be understood. Could the true fear of witches lie in the idea that there were forces at work in the world that humanity couldn't control? Witches were feared not because of their power, but because of what that power represented, an understanding of the supernatural that humanity was unwilling to confront. The true horror lay not in the magic they wielded, but in how society could not comprehend the existence of forces beyond its control. Could it be that the witch trials were not about witches at the witch's final prayer? Before their executions, many accused witches were asked to pray for their souls, or to repent for their supposed crimes. These final prayers were seen as a form of spiritual redemption, an attempt to absolve themselves of the dark powers they were accused of wielding. In some cases, these prayers were part of the spectacle, used to show the public that the witches were truly sorry for their alleged pact with the devil. But what if the real horror of the witch's final prayer wasn't in the act itself, but in how it became a symbol of society's need for closure and justification? The final prayer became a tool used by the authorities to frame the execution as an act of divine justice. In many cases, the prayer was coerced, a last-ditch attempt to save the soul of the accused from eternal damnation. The horror wasn't just in the forced confessions or the prayer itself. It was in the way these final moments became a spectacle that reinforced the power of the church and the authority of the state. The true terror of the witch's final prayer was in how it symbolized the role of fear and manipulation in the witch trials. It wasn't about redemption, it was about control. Could the real horror lie not in the prayer, but in the way it served as the final act of submission, ensuring that the witch's death would be seen as just, even if she was innocent? The witch's confession, under torture. The confessions extracted from accused witches under torture were often considered to be the final evidence of their guilt. Torture was used as a method to force witches to confess their supposed crimes, with the belief that the pain would compel them to reveal the truth. In many cases, these confessions were false, coerced under extreme physical and psychological pressure. But what if the true horror wasn't in the confessions themselves, but in the way torture became an official tool of justice, manipulating the search for truth into a tool of control and power? The real terror of the witch trials lay not just in the forced confessions, but in the way these confessions were used to validate the fears of the community. The torture turned the witch into a symbol of evil, confirming the belief that witches were capable of unspeakable acts. The horror wasn't in what was confessed, but in the idea that fear could be justified and reinforced by pain and suffering. Could it be that the true horror of the witch trials was not the confessions of guilt, but the way torture turned people into instruments of fear? The confessions were not truth. They were products of terror, transformed into a tool for punishing the innocent. Could the real terror be the manipulation of pain into the creation of truth that condemned the living to death? Witches and the power of transformation. Witches were believed to possess the ability to transform themselves and others into animals or other beings. This power to change shape was seen as one of the most feared abilities of witches, as it allowed them to escape from their human form and move between worlds. The belief in shape-shifting reinforced the idea that witches were agents of chaos, capable of defying the laws of nature. But what if the real horror wasn't in the transformation itself, but in the fear that witches could manipulate their identity and escape the constraints of society? The fear of witches transforming was rooted in the belief that they could transcend the human realm and escape the physical limitations imposed on them. This power was seen as both dangerous and unnatural, as it suggested that witches could slip through the cracks of society's rules and live beyond its control. The real terror wasn't in the shape-shifting, but in how it symbolized the ability to break free from societal constraints, to be something other than human. Could it be that the true horror of shape-shifting was not in the witch's ability to transform, but in the fear that such transformation could represent the destruction of identity and the unravelling of society's rules? The witch's power wasn't just magical, it was a reminder of the chaos that lurked beneath the surface of the world, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of reality itself. Witches and the demon's mark. A significant part of the witch trial phenomenon was the belief that witches bore a demon's mark, a physical sign of their pact with the devil. This mark could take many forms, from strange moles to blemishes that wouldn't bleed when pricked. The presence of such a mark was considered irrefutable evidence of the witch's evil, and many accused witches were tortured to find it. But what if the true horror wasn't the mark itself, but in how this symbol became an instrument of condemnation, turning something as natural as a mole into proof of monstrous evil? The demon's mark was a terrifying symbol because it suggested that witches had been marked by evil forces, making them unredeemable. The horror lay not just in the physical mark, but in the way it was used to justify extreme punishment, allowing entire communities to turn on those who were accused. Could the real terror be found in the way society could take something as harmless as a birthmark and transform it into an unassailable symbol of guilt and damnation? The fear of the demon's mark reflected a deeper anxiety about purity, innocence, and the inherent corruption that could be found in the human body. The real horror wasn't just in the mark, it was in how this physical sign became the justification for the ultimate punishment. Could the true terror lie in the belief that anyone could be marked, and once marked, was forever condemned? The Witches of Pendle Hill. The Witches of Pendle Hill in England were involved in one of the most famous witch trials of the 17th century. The trial, known as the Pendle Witch Trials, involved 12 people, many of whom were accused of witchcraft and subsequently hanged. The case became a symbol of the fear of witches in England, with the accused witches allegedly having the power to control the weather and cause death. But what if the true horror of the Pendle Witch Trial wasn't in the accusations, but in how they were used to reinforce the social order and control the community through fear? The Pendle witches were accused not only of witchcraft but of the most dangerous crimes, using their magical abilities to curse individuals, cause illness, and manipulate the weather. The horror wasn't just in the death sentences, it was in how witchcraft became a way for those in power to control and eliminate those who posed a threat to the social structure. Could the real terror lie in the way the Pendle trials became a tool for the powerful to maintain control over the fears of the community? The legacy of the Pendle witches serves as a chilling reminder of how fear can be used as a tool of control, turning individuals into scapegoats and justifying cruel punishments. The true horror wasn't just the accusations, it was the way fear of witches could become a mechanism for oppression. Could the Pendle witch trial have been more than just a hunt for witches? It could have been a way to silence dissent and maintain control over the masses. The end of the witch hunts. The witch hunts eventually came to an end, not because people stopped believing in witches, but because the rise of scientific thinking and rationalism began to challenge the old superstitions. The Enlightenment brought with it an era of reason, and the witch trials slowly died out across Europe. But what if the real horror of the witch hunts wasn't just in the executions, but in how they revealed the fragility of reason in the face of fear, superstition, and the desire for control? The end of the witch hunts didn't mark the end of the fear of witches, but it did represent a shift in how society dealt with fear. The real horror was not in the witch trials themselves, but in how deeply they revealed humanity's capacity for cruelty in the face of fear. Could the true terror be the way fear of the unknown could cause an entire society to turn on itself, destroying lives in the name of control and power? The final death of the witch hunts marked the end of an era, but it didn't erase the fear that witches, and what they represented, could return. The real horror of the witch hunts wasn't just the deaths of the witches, it was in how easily fear could rise again, and how society could fall back into superstition, cruelty, and chaos. Could it be that the true terror of the witch hunt still lingers today, in the way fear and suspicion can tear apart the fabric of civilization? Reflect on the horrors that these historical moments reveal. Could the fear of witches spread across centuries still hold power over our perceptions today? Share your thoughts and join the conversation. What do these trials tell us about the darker aspects of human nature? The trials may have ended, but the fear and whispers of witches remain. Are they gone for good, or do they still linger in the forgotten corners of history, waiting to be uncovered once more? As the past reveals its dark secrets, we are left to wonder, what are the true forces at play, and what might they awaken next?